The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Right, okay. Order, order. Christina Rees to move the motion.
Thank you, Sir Edward. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, as always. I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 649-894 relating to financial risk checks for gambling. The petitioners are specifically asking to stop the implementation of affordability and financial risk checks. They want the government to abandon the planned implementation of checks for some people who want to place a bet. They believe such checks, which they say could include assessing whether people are at risk of harm, based on their postcode or job title are inappropriate and discriminatory. The government has responded to say that they are committed to a proportionate, frictionless system of financial risk checks to protect those at risk of harm without over-regulating. The Gambling Commission will set out its plans in due course. There are, however, a number of perspectives on the purpose and delivery of such checks, and I shall do my best to present these to you today. For context, the Gambling Act 2005 regulates gambling in Britain, and on the 8th of December 2020, the government published a review. Its purpose was to examine whether the 2005 Act provided the right balance of regulation in the digital age. There were around 16,000 responses to the review, and the government's response in the form of the white paper entitled High Stakes, Gambling Reform for the Digital Age was published on the 27th of April 2023. The White Paper's proposals for reform of online gambling included new obligations on operators to perform financial risk checks if a customer's gambling is likely to be unaffordable and harmful. The document stated that this would target 3 types of risk: binge gambling, significant unaffordable losses over time, and financially vulnerable customers. The arguments for and against the implementation of the checks can be categorized according to 3 groups of stakeholders: industry, reformers, and consumers. I will present each in turn, following several extensive evidence sessions with a range of individuals and organizations, such as the petition creators, the Jockey Club, the Betting and Gaming Council, Charlie Ritchie from Gambling with Lives, Dr. James Noyes, and the Gambling Commission. Firstly, the gambling industry. I can understand the concerns operators may have regarding the impact of checks on profits, not least because research shows that the top 10% of gamblers delivered 80% of operator revenue. For horse racing, the numbers are even more stark, with 85% of operator income coming from around 5% of online betting accounts. Operators argue that affordability checks are inappropriate and discriminatory, that in theory, punters would be prevented from betting more than £1.37 per day, and that such checks push vulnerable gamblers into the black market. It is suggested that online turnover is down 20% since non-statutory checks have been in place. But the issue of affordability is not new. The industry itself pushed for it back in 2019 and continued to recognise the need for regulation and markers of harm. The government has already flagged it as a priority long before the White Paper, and the Gambling Commission has already consulted on it and accommodated it within changes to regulation. What is new is that since the White Paper, the government and the Gambling Commission have proposed actual figures for these checks. Affordability is no longer abstract. It is tied to precise thresholds. So what are these thresholds? The Gambling Commission has consulted on 2 forms of check. First, background checks at moderate levels of spend for financial vulnerability, proposed at £125 net loss within a month or £500 within a year. Then at higher levels of spend to check for harmful binge gambling or sustained affordability losses, proposed at £1,000 net loss within 24 hours or £2,000 within 90 days. In other words, the checks are threefold. They are for financial vulnerability, significant losses over a short time, and significant losses over a long time. Background checks on financial vulnerability will be frictionless, using publicly available information like credit reference data and negative indicators such as CCJs and insolvency, while higher risk accounts will have more enhanced checks using open banking and other options. With increasing degrees of intrusion, the further into the journey you go. For these more enhanced checks, they say that they would be narrowly targeted, with only around 3% of online gambling accounts affected. The vast majority of these checks would be frictionless, with the Commission advocating light touch assessment, applying the data minimisation principle and focusing on publicly available data. Only 0.3% of account holders would be expected to hand over additional financial information. Industry bodies and operators point to checks that are already happening and suggest they are far from frictionless. But these are checks that have been introduced voluntarily by individual operators and not necessarily the frictionless procedures being developed by the government. The second group of stakeholders, reformers such as researchers, campaign groups and government itself, have long supported the need for affordability checks on the most vulnerability gamblers and harmful betting. They point to the research regarding the disproportionate nature of 80% of profits coming from 10% of accounts and highlight the well-accepted belief that disproportionate profits lead to harmful losses. In addition, campaign groups are keen to point out that different forms of gambling carry different risks. Things like playing bingo or the National Lottery, or even the vast majority of horse racing betting, is vastly different to the experience and potential for harm of things such as online casinos and fruit. Of course.
I'm most grateful, and I must congratulate the Honourable Member for Neath for securing this significant debate in which she can tell there is a great deal of interest from across the House. She mentions horse racing. Will she press the Minister to respond, who will be responding to this debate, to give what reassurances he can to the horse racing community, and I speak for Ludlow Racecourse, which is an important employer and source of entertainment in my constituency, known to members opposite, that this industry will not be threatened inadvertently by the measures to introduce affordability for vulnerable gamblers, which I think we all want to see.
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, and he's making a very valid point. I'm sure the Minister is listening, as he always does. He's very... Yes, of course.
To reinforce the point which my honourable friend for Ludlow has made, I represent Epsom Downs Racecourse and indeed, more particularly, the training industry in Epsom, for whom, in a smaller centre where the owners are not wealthy Arabs but simply people who enjoy participating in racing, the impact on the trainers of measures that really damage the industry would be enormous. It's not just about the racecourse, it's about the livelihoods of the people who train and who operate the training stables. So could I ask her to impress upon the Minister that there is a genuine issue around things like online casinos, but tackling those must not be at the expense of the racing industry that's so important to so many communities across the country.
I thank the Right Honourable Member for his intervention, and yet again a very valid point, and I'm sure the Minister listened to that as well, and he will respond in due course. And the number of members that have turned up today to speak is an indication of just how important this topic is to your constituents and to your constituency. So as I was saying, things like playing bingo or the National Lottery or even the vast majority of horse racing betting is vastly different to the experience and potential for harm of things such as online casinos and fruit machines. Researchers understand the importance of carefully considering the figures around the threshold for checks. They need to be appropriate, but they also need to be meaningful. They need to be preventative. On the arguments that such checks are inappropriate, campaigners rebuke the claim, pointing out that checks which reduce harm are very much appropriate. An example often cited is of how people would wish to produce documentation to produce a gin and tonic. And that is, of course, true. No one would wish to be in that situation. However, there are many examples where the family of harmful drinkers ask a local shop to prevent a sale, or indeed where someone is so drunk that they refused another drink. Neither, it is argued, are the checks discriminatory. They are no different to the checks undertaken almost instantly when a consumer clicks to purchase a product online using the Klarna 3-payment procedure. Finally, we must consider the voices of the consumer, the punter. For most, gambling is not harmful, and bets are small, proportionate and affordable. A lucky dip on the lotto, a lucky 15 on the horses, a flutter once a year on the Grand National. The proposed checks... Yeah, for sure.
Many of my constituents enjoy taking part in the time-honoured tradition of having a bet at the races at the fantastic Uttoxeter racecourse in my patch. And they're concerned by the proposals that an annual £500 net loss threshold, which, as the Honourable Lady has already said, equates to just £1.37 a day, is going to lead to intrusive checks limiting their freedom to spend their money on an activity of their choosing. Does she agree with me that if affordability checks are to be implemented, they should be carefully and deliberately targeted at those who are most at risk of harm?
Thank the Honourable Member for her intervention, and I'm having a tour of the constituency racecourse here, which is good for a little woman from Wales who's learning all about geography today. Yes, indeed, should be measured. The proposed checks will not affect these customers at all. It is important not to conflate the views of industry with the views of consumers. Affordability checks are not about attacking consumer rights or curbing individual liberties. They are about upholding consumer protection and curbing operator excess.
Was she aware of that point?
Yeah, for sure.
She said it's not about anything other than protecting the consumer. Can she think of any other area where the government checks how much money you've got for your own?
Well, you...
Payday lenders.
Yeah, the Honourable Member, I thank you for your intervention. Payday loan sharks might be an example, but I'm sure the Minister will respond in his due course. I slipped out of that one, I think. I tried to. The responsibility lies with industry and operators, not with the customers. In summary, Sir Edward, it is understandable that industry bodies, operators and the horse racing community have concerns about the introduction of financial risk checks. But the idea of introducing checks is not new, and the need for regulation against harmful betting is supported by industry and consumers alike. The issue seems to be that such checks need to be frictionless, without negative impact on punters or operator revenue, and without pushing vulnerable gamblers into the black market. It would be useful if the Minister takes this opportunity to outline how frictionless checks will work and when pilot schemes will be introduced. Thank you, Sir Edward.
So I'll remind members that they should bob if they wish to be called. We have got 3 hours, quite a long time, but I want to get everybody in, and I don't want to impose a time limit at the moment. But perhaps those who are called early can look around them and see there's a lot of people trying to take part in this debate, and they can keep their speeches brisk which is always the best policy, I would have thought anyway, and certainly not more than 10 minutes. So the question is that this House has considered E-petition 649894 relating to financial risk checks for gambling. And the first member I shall call, I'm sure I can rely on to give a brisk speech, Philip Davis.
The Chair, I'm not renowned for brisk speeches, but I will try my best. I'm sure the people of Market Raisin are delighted to see you taking such an interest in this debate. I should start, Sir Edward, by referring people to my entry in the Register of Members' Interests. People will see that I have occasionally accepted hospitality from the betting industry and the horse racing industry. I'm also an unpaid board member of the Racehorse Owners Association, and as I always mention on these occasions, I'm the modest owner of racehorses and the owner of modest racehorses. I would like to thank the Honourable Member for Neath for opening the debate and for the Petitions Committee as a whole for allowing this debate to take place. I also particularly want to thank Nevin Truesdale from the Jockey Club for launching this petition, to everyone who signed it to enable this debate to take place, and I also want to thank the Racing Post, who did a tremendous job getting behind the petition, but have also done sterling work in highlighting the damage the proposed affordability checks could do to punters and the sport of horse racing. I also want to commend the Minister, my constituency neighbour, who inherited this policy and whose engagement with all stakeholders has been exemplary. I want to make it clear from the outset that there are two groups I want to speak up for today. The horse racing industry is one, but first and foremost, I want to speak up for punters, the one group of people who have been largely ignored in this long-running debate and tug-of-war over affordability checks. They often get caught up in the crossfire in the arguments between the well-funded betting industry and the well-funded anti-gambling campaigners. Sir Edward, I've got no intention of speaking up for bookmakers, partly because most of them in the industry are big enough to speak up for themselves, and partly because their position on stake restrictions is inconsistent, and that is the kindest word I can use. On the one hand, bookmakers will say it is wrong for the state to restrict how much people can gamble, but on the other hand, the bookmakers are the most guilty of all in restricting the stakes of punters who have the audacity to back too many winners, often to pennies rather than pounds. I've warned them time and again that trying to have their cake and eat it on punter restrictions would backfire, and so until and unless they abandon that anti-punter mentality, what they do on this issue will always be subject to some level of ridicule. The principle that people should only bet what they can afford is not a controversial one. It will be the first advice any of us would give to anyone who starts betting. However, what the government and the Gambling Commission are proposing is completely unacceptable. What is proposed is frictionless checks for people who have a net spend of just £125 over a rolling 30-day period, or £500 in a year, with enhanced checks taking place for anyone with a net loss of £1,000 in 24 hours or £2,000 over 90 days. Now, I have a number of concerns about this approach, both practically and in principle. I find it somewhat offensive that the Government and the Gambling Commission believe that there is something inherently distasteful about betting. If that is not the case, why does the Government propose this type of affordability check just on gambling? Why do they not ask every retailer in the country to carry out similar checks on customers to ensure they can afford to buy whatever it is they come to the counter with? Is the Minister really claiming that nobody spends more on alcohol than is good for them, more on shoes than they should, or more on holidays than they can actually afford? I will briefly.
He doesn't even need to talk about products that are that addictive. As one of my constituents has pointed out, no one checks on him if he spends £150 on a dinner for two people. So would he accept that even if the principle is conceded that there should be some checks, the level at which this has been set is far too low?
I very much agree with my right honourable friend, as I happily do on most things, Sir Edward. Of course, people spend more than they should on all these other things, but the government is only snobbishly treating punters as some kind of pariah, which I do not appreciate. In Parliament, we should stand up for people's freedoms. I don't believe I was elected to Parliament to stop everyone else from doing all the things I don't happen to like myself, but it seems that some in here think their job is to do nothing other than that. It's unacceptable to me that the government, the Gambling Commission and the bookmakers will basically between them decide how much each individual punter can afford to spend on their betting. And the punter themselves will get virtually no say in this whatsoever. It's completely outrageous. The Conservative Party used to believe in individual freedom and individual responsibility, and some of us, Sir Edward, still do. But I suspect if you asked everyone how much responsibility each should take for determining how much somebody can afford to spend on betting, I doubt anyone would say the individual concerned had a 0% responsibility for it. But that's the route down which we are in danger of going. It's absurd to think that bookmakers and regulators should be able to decide how much each individual person in the country should be allowed to spend on betting. When people open an online betting account, or the next time people log in, perhaps they should be forced to enter how much they want to limit their spend to over a fixed period, and the responsibility for ensuring they don't go over that should rest with the bookmaker, but not the decision as to how much they can afford in the first place. I'll give away very briefly.
From giving way. Does it not strike him also that there is a degree of hypocrisy here when actually a large proportion of problem gamblers are actually just using National Lottery scratch cards, who are really in great difficulty, compared to those who gamble on horse racing? It's about 4 times higher.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I know he's a big supporter of Windsor Racecourse in his constituency. I'll come on to that later. I hope you'll be think about the interventions I'm taking, Sir Edward, when I don't want to get in your trouble. Thankfully, readers of the Racing Post and punters still believe in the timeless conservative principle of individual responsibility. In a recent poll of punters carried out by the Racing Post, when asked which of the following do you think is best placed to assess if your betting is affordable, 96.6% of them said they were. 1.8% said the Gambling Commission, 1% said bookmakers, and 0.6% said the government. If that isn't a giant raspberry to the proposed affordability checks, I don't know what is. Everyone knows that the problem gambling rates in the UK are extremely low and certainly don't justify anything remotely close to what is being proposed. However, it's also pretty obvious to most people with common sense that these affordability checks are likely to make things worse for people with a gambling addiction rather than better. Does anyone seriously think that anyone who has a serious gambling addiction, if and when they're told by an online bookmaker that they're no longer allowed to bet with them, will just stop betting completely? It's pretty obvious that those people will do all they can to carry on with their addiction, and that will mean going to the black market where there are no controls on people's behaviour. The Gambling Commission, the Honourable Gentleman will have an opportunity to have his say later, but I'm just anxious about the Chairman's strictures. The Gambling Commission has always said the threat from the black market is overstated, whilst at the same time, like most quangos, telling the government they need more money to tackle it. I hope the Minister will make clear today that he doesn't underestimate the threat from the black market. Only today, the front page of the Racing Post shows the results of a special investigation into the Post Bookmakers, an unregulated firm with 1,300 customers who said they were expecting a ridiculously busy Cheltenham and where they recommended the customer deposited as much as they can. How on earth can making it more likely people go to firms like that possibly help in tackling problem gambling? And of course, the wonderful sport of horse racing derives much of its income from the gambling industry. And so the more people go to the black market, the less money there is for the sport of horse racing. British racing is the best and most prestigious in the world. It's the second biggest spectator sport in the UK after football, brings a huge amount of foreign investment into the country, and is a huge part of the rural economy. It also provides a huge amount of pleasure to millions of people across the country. The government cannot possibly allow itself to introduce measures, however well-meaning, which will have a devastating effect on this great sport. 24,000 race owners in the UK invest over £500 million into the rural economy and pay £32 million a month in training fees, employing over 350 racehorse trainers who employ some 80,000 people. The least they should be allowed is to have a bet on their own horses as well. We can't allow decisions to be made which put that investment at risk. However much I would like the Government and the Gambling Commission to abandon this affordability check policy, I've not been here so long without accepting that sometimes some battles are impossible to win. And I therefore accept that the Government may feel it has invested too much in the affordability check debate to be able to abandon it completely. And so I also have some suggestions to make to the Minister which might help make this policy less bad, which I hope he will consider. The Government have said that they want financial checks to be frictionless, but as currently envisaged, they would be anything but. First of all, will the Minister pledge to ensure that any checks will be based on net deposits, not gross deposits, which will make a material difference? Second, it's currently envisaged that enhanced affordability checks will be based on Cato data. This is used primarily by loan industries to determine if a customer can afford a loan. It focuses on money flowing in and money flowing out of an individual's account. This is precisely the wrong kind of test, as it second-guesses what someone can afford in a subjective manner. Cato does not consider financial vulnerability, and it's extremely unhelpful when it comes to people with irregular money flows, such as the self-employed, entrepreneurs and high-wealth but low-income individuals. Will the Minister pledge to not use Cato data for those reasons? And if he insists on going ahead with affordability checks, use score data instead. Score data is much more appropriate as it shows if someone is showing signs of financial vulnerability and distress. It flags people who are falling behind on the rent or people with missed mortgage payments, defaults on loans, etc. These checks are crucially entirely frictionless and do not discriminate against any group such as the self-employed. Surely, when the government envisaged affordability checks, this is what it had in mind, checking that people were not resorting to gambling in order to win their mortgage payment they had fallen behind on, rather than trying to second-guess what each individual can afford to spend on gambling. I look forward to the Minister's response to this suggestion. And can he also make clear where anti-money laundering checks will fit in with the affordability check regime? Another suggestion, Sir Edward, if the government does insist on these affordability checks, is to differentiate between games of skill and games of chance, i.e. separate sports betting from online slots and roulette. Horse racing is not a game of chance and, in my view, should not be treated as such. Incredibly, as my honourable friend for Windsor made clear, the government currently envisages games of chance, some of them, to be treated more favourably than games of skill. I don't think that the National Lottery will be subject to affordability checks. And that can't possibly be right, that people who bet on horse racing is, but people who bet on the lottery isn't. Can the Minister confirm that that won't be the case, or give an explanation as to why it will? Not including the National Lottery in these measures would indicate a disregard for the people who are losing money and only an interest in the people who are winning money. If we're concerned for problem gamblers, why is it okay if they've lost all their money to the lottery just because that money goes to good causes rather than to bookmakers? The National Lottery must be included in all the measures in the White Paper. I end, Sir Edward, where I began, by urging the Minister to look after the interests of all punters, to ensure that nothing is done to threaten the horse racing industry, which will never forgive the government otherwise, and to stand up for the key Conservative principle of individual freedom and individual responsibility. It is not too late to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat.
Caroline Harris.
Edward, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And may I congratulate my honourable friend for Neath for leading on this debate. It's an honour to speak in this petition debate on a topic that I am truly passionate about, reducing gambling harm and protecting those most vulnerable. According to the Gambling Commission, 22.5 million people in this country gamble. That equates to around 44% of the adult population, an overwhelming majority do so without any issue, but not everyone does. And for those for whom gambling is an addiction, the Commission and the Government have a duty to act responsibly and to protect them from harm. The publication of the long overdue Gambling White Paper last April was therefore widely welcomed by the Gambling-Related Harm, APPG, of which I chair, as well as a growing community of organisations, charities, academics and clinicians, all intent on reducing gambling harm, protecting vulnerable and saving lives. Whilst concerns remain about the consultation times on the proposals in the White Paper, subsequently how long it will take us to get to where we need to be, what is important today is that we lay out why these changes are so critical and specifically the positive impact that affordability checks will have in reducing harm and saving lives. In their patterns of play research, the Gambling Commission identified that the most profitable 1% of accounts make up 70.4% of the gross gambling yield, echoing previous research from the University of Liverpool. The gambling industry is relying on a hugely disproportionate percentage of its profits coming from those affected by gambling addiction who are subsequently being harmed by unaffordable losses. Now, historically, the industry has recognised the need for responsible gambling and ensuring that customers spend within their means. In 2018, seems like a lifetime ago, the Senate group The industry standards body, which was later absorbed into the Betting and Gaming Council, set out 3 steps which responsible gamblers should adhere to. Only gamble what you can afford, set limits, and not chase losses. Suggesting someone gripped by addiction would be able to make rational decisions on what is affordable is somewhat naive. Nobody would even contemplate this for any other addiction. So surely the logical way forward would be to productively introduce affordability checks on anyone gambling larger sums. I certainly will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and congratulate her on all the work she does on this matter. Would she agree that primarily the focus around this issue is protecting the most vulnerable people in our communities, and it's also not about being anti-gambling per se? The reality is that the industry has failed to act, which is why these measures are needed to protect the most vulnerable people in our communities, and it is a small price to pay to protect those people.
I totally do agree. Anti-gambling is one thing I'm not. I am very, very fond of visiting the racetrack, as I am the bingo hall. My motive does not come from being anti-gambling. I want to protect vulnerable people. So surely the logical way forward would be to proactively introduce affordable checks on anyone gambling larger sums. These would not stop anyone who can afford to from betting as much as they choose, but it would stop those who can't. After carefully considering the evidence, the government included a consultation on 2 forms of these affordability checks in their proposals in the White Paper. The first would consist of background checks on those spending moderate levels, which would look at financial vulnerability. The proposed limits for these checks to be triggered would be a net loss of £125 within a month or £500 within a year. The second would be a more enhanced check for those regularly spending higher levels, which may indicate a binge gambling problem. The proposed thresholds for these would be a £1,000 net loss within 24 hours and £2,000 within 90 days. Half for those aged between 18 and 24, given that this group have already been identified as being at greater risk of harm. While many have jumped to condemn these checks, it is important to be clear about who would be impacted by them. Recent research conducted by Dr. Philip Newell from the University of Bristol and Dr. David Zendel from the University of York, using open banker data, found that the unharmed gamblers have an average monthly spend of £16.41. This compares to £208.91 for the highest risk group. This suggests that risk-free gamblers would very rarely trigger any affordability checks. If anything, the figures highlight the fact that the proposed thresholds are actually far too high and could be set at a lower level. And let's be clear, the initial background checks for financial vulnerability would be frictionless, using publicly available information such as credit reference data alongside negative indicators such as county court judgments and insolvency checks. And the enhanced checks would initially use open banking, with more intrusive checks only being triggered further down the line. It must also be put into perspective that these enhanced checks would be narrowly targeted to around 3% of the online gambling accounts affected. And I can say at this point that it is the online accounts that are key here. Online is where the most harm is taking place. It's where people, incredibly vulnerable people, are able to spend until last week's announcement without limits. Money that they just don't have, with no intervention, with no contact with anyone that might just notice a problem. Online is causing harm at rates far in excess of any land-based venue, and it is important that we keep that in mind. As an APPG, our focus has always been on this, and we have continually called for the likes of horse racing tracks and bingo halls to be considered separately when it comes to legislation. Of those 3% of affected online gambling accounts, The vast majority of checks would be frictionless, and the Gambling Commission has already advocated for the focus of checks to be on publicly available data. Research suggests that only 0.3% of account holders would be subject to the level of checks that would require them to hand over any additional financial information. But it seems that this smaller number of enhanced checks that would require consent of the part of the individual are actually being used as a scaremongering tactic to turn the debate on affordability into a controversial topic. Given that they have such a minimum impact, it's difficult to see why these checks have been contested so vehemently. The industry, we know, has stirred up the controversy by exaggerating the levels of intrusion and suggesting that they would drive gamblers to the black market. This loses the whole point of the checks, which is to protect gamblers from harm by ensuring that they are spending within their means. Surely this is in the interest of the industry, who currently have a reputation for allowing those unable to control their gambling far in excess of what they can afford to spend. I certainly will.
Given way, she's making some really strong points, and she's done some excellent work on this issue. The point I would make is when you talk to people who have lived with and are living with serious gambling addiction, what comes across very strongly is the way that they will alter their behaviours to avoid accountability, to avoid scrutiny, to the point of using multiple identities. That being the case, what confidence does the Honourable Lady have that these kind of checks, which, as she says herself, some of which will be intrusive, really will drive the better outcomes that we all hope to see?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention, and my response to that would be, just because we haven't got all the answers now doesn't mean to say we shouldn't do anything to protect those who are vulnerable. It's our responsibility to make sure the system does work to protect these vulnerable gamblers. It's ironic that the same industry that just a few years ago set out the 3 steps for responsible gambling, which included only gambling what is affordable, the same industry that still spend big bucks on safer gambling logos and promoting Safe Gambling Week, it seems the case of talking the talk but being totally unwilling to walk the walk and actually implementing the measures that could protect the most vulnerable customers. As I said at the beginning, we know that the vast majority of the 22.5 million people gambling in this country enjoy doing so safely and within their own limits. Nobody, least of all me, wants to stop them to be able to do this. We've already established that the number of those who could trigger a check as a result of their spending, even if it is money they can afford to spend, is negligible. The argument against affordability checks is therefore a very difficult one to grasp, when a slight inconvenience for a very small number will be protective of very more people. The argument for affordability checks is comprehensive. It will stop those gripped by addiction from gambling more than they can afford. It will reduce the levels of harm that we are currently seeing. It will protect the industry's most vulnerable customers. And most importantly, and I say this, that there are people in this room today who have lost children because of this addiction. It will save lives. Thank you, Sir Edward.
To speak in this particular debate under your chairmanship, and I apologise if I have to disappear briefly at 6 o'clock for a charity meeting, but I will be back in here, I pledge, before the wind-ups. Can I just say that in following the Honourable Lady, my honourable friend in this particular case, she has made most of the case, the strong case that exists. But I just want to touch on a few particular points. It seems to me this debate today should not be for or against affordability checks, which I don't think it really is. In fact, my honourable friend invariably ends up being in the right place on some of these, and he has made the case quite rightly about debating what levels and how this works, and who should be in and who should not be in. And I thought that was quite interesting, actually. And I want to come back to his point about it being frictionless. And I agree with him. If there are to be checks, they need to be frictionless and as unobtrusive as possible, because these are about the early onset of issues and problems, and they should act as flags and as the nudge theory, which says something isn't right here, rather than an absolute sort of down, as it were. And he made 3 points. Net deposits not, Cato checks won't work. I agree completely with that as well. And finally, I agree that the score data is an issue here. And I think that all of those points he makes are really important points, and I recommend them to my right honourable friend who will be winding up. But it is important also to understand, I think, I was never really in favour of these checks originally when I first started, but having spent time with the charities, spent time with those families that have lost members of their family, and the one point that comes across time and again is that had there been an early moment in the process of that when either they had realised what they were up to or that others had been able to say to them, stop, 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 where are you going with this? Many of those disasters would not have actually happened. And so we need to see this in the context of how we can stop that early onset of the addiction and the process that takes place, as we would in anything else, to be honest with you. It's a human issue. It's not a principle of freedom versus non-freedom. There are many things that we have dwelt in the course of the many hundreds of years in this place where absolute freedoms have to be constrained to some degree, and you limit that as much as you possibly can. And I think that is the case in this process, which is why I think we should here be able to settle on that. Can I first of all say that I don't have a racecourse in my constituency, but I used to have a dog track. The dog track closed. It was a very famous dog track, but it closed because the owners themselves decided they could make more money by going online and online gambling rather than allowing people to come to the stadium and bet, which I had done in the past. And I have to say, I, like anybody, well, perhaps not everybody, but anybody else, likes to go to race meets, and I like to bet on horses because it makes it more exciting. And I always try and go to the ring to do that. And I have to say that race course owners have done no good to the ring, which is really proper betting. They've pushed it further and further in many cases away from the smart stadiums. And these are the people where they will say to you occasionally, sometimes, you know, you already bet on this and you sure you want to put this bet? I've had that on, no I haven't, but I've seen others have that on a number of occasions. So I say that, and I've stood up for them when they've had all those problems. So this is not about being against gambling, it's about being against the untrammelled levels that affect those who are most vulnerable. That is the key. And just let me make this point, though. So let's just make it very clear what is not on the table here. As things stand, there are no checks for on-course bookmakers, and none are planned. And I would be against that in this particular regard, should we decide to go down that road. And first of all, also, this is important, that the same exists for land gambling, as it were. So that we are not, that has not been the case of planning to check those or to stop those in the same way as online. I'll come back to online in a second.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way, and he's making a very important point about the need for balance in this policy. And having spoken to a lot of the breeders and trainers in my constituency in Wiltshire, there's a very strong argument against these proposals, but we've also heard the case for them. The fact that this debate itself is so well attended, the fact there is so much controversy about these proposals, suggests to me that there is a problem with the policy-making process. And I remember I was on with a civil servant at DCMS when, in fact, the member for West Suffolk was Secretary of State there, how policy-making is done. And I think there is a problem with that, which is that the people who are most involved, most expert and most likely to be affected by the policies that we make here are not properly involved in the deliberations that go into policy making. And I wonder whether he agrees with me and whether he could make the point to the Minister that actually, given the degree of controversy over these proposals, we do need to delay the implementation and involve a wider group of stakeholders and experts in the consultation that should have happened up till now.
Well, he's made his point through me to the Minister, and I'm sure he will deal with that. I will say that this consultation didn't happen overnight, and it has been going on for some time, but I accept that others may think they haven't had enough time. In fact, I think the gambling industry may have made a bigger impact on this by taking a full part of this and not always wanting to be intruded on by questions which, as the group has done on many occasions, many of them chose to stay away from that. And I just want to also make out the point that very few people would be impacted by the proposed checks. Many of the concerns set up by punters at the moment are the checks that the industry is already themselves carrying out. and they intrude like mad on behaviour. That is their biggest area where they want to deal in the behaviour of punters, because, as we've heard already, we know that for the gambling industry, they make most of their money, the vast majority of their money, on those who are losing money at a rate of knots. And in fact, again, my honourable friend said a very interesting point, which I agreed with, which is quite often they then block those gamblers that have been successful, and you find that this information travels across the gambling companies. So a gambler who happens to be moderately successful or well successful finds themselves taken off the lists of all of those gambling companies. So they are not about openness and freedom and choice. They are the last people that are interested in that. We may be debating this, but they're not debating it because they don't want to lose money themselves. And also, the important point is that they themselves haven't shown a huge amount of respect for the racing industry, the horse racing industry. You know, many of the time they now push, if you go to them, betting shops are now also encouraged to cross over to FOBTs, now B3s, and to SSBTs, which allow cash remote betting inside shops. The remote sector has long looked to cross-sell away from the horse race betting to other sport betting. So, you know, one thing I want to make absolutely clear, they are not that interested in the success in the future of horse racing per se, but just how much money that they can take out of it. I am desperately keen that the horse racing industry should thrive. I absolutely believe it offers huge prospects for those in the rural areas. It's a hugely successful industry. It's a global industry now, and no one supports it more than I do. But I'm going to complete and end this now by simply saying the debate today shouldn't be about the absolute purity of no checks. I think what we are here today to look at, what are the levels and how intrusive will they be? If we can achieve that debate and the right decision is made finally by the Minister, I think this will mean that this will be much better, and fewer people at the end of the day will either lose their lives or become so addicted because of the desperate nature of what they've been doing in darkened rooms behind closed doors is what we want to try and stop and to save their lives. Thank you.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Sir Edward, and it is a pleasure to serve under you in the chair, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Neath for bringing this debate to this chamber. And I think what the debate has already shown this afternoon, this is very much a question of balance. We do recognise the problem of gambling and gambling addiction, but we also understand that there are many forms of gambling, and the majority of people speaking here today are here because we are supporting horse racing and race courses, and we must make sure that we don't try to stop harm, which we absolutely all are in favour of doing, but not putting the baby out with the bathwater and putting out of business wonderful facilities in our communities and that enjoy so much support. If, Sir Edward, affordability checks are to be implemented, they should be carefully and deliberately targeted at those most at risk of harm, and we've already heard this exact sentence this afternoon. We need to ensure that problem gambling does not ruin more lives. We all believe in the need to protect people from gambling harms, and reforms are overdue. There are 400,000 problem gamblers in the UK, including some 60,000 children aged 11 to 16. So those figures are stark. However, my Bath constituency is lucky to enjoy an active and vibrant horse racing scene. Bath is Britain's highest flat racecourse, with a distinguished history of racing going back to 1811, but racing was first recorded in Bath in 1728, which only is a reminder that people didn't come to Bath just to take the waters. Bath Racecourse is an incredibly important venue for the city. It hosts over 20 races each season, but much more, it is also a venue for family days, live music and many other large-scale events. It was also a vaccination hub during the pandemic. It is an important employer and welcomes thousands of visitors. And not surprisingly, many constituents have signed the petition today. British racing is particularly vulnerable to changes made to gambling regulations, and we must ensure that we get this right, as we have already heard this afternoon many times. The racecourse has expressed concerns to me about proposed affordability checks. They believe a one-size-fits-all approach will not work, And again, I echo this. Currently proposed affordability checks will be the same for everyone, no matter how much they can earn or what their disposable betting income is. Bath Racecourse have welcomed government assurances that most consumers will not actively notice checks taking place. It is right that checks will be frictionless, but Bath Racecourse is concerned that intrusive checks could put off punters, as we have already heard. And I have to say, I'm not an expert. I don't own any moderately successful race horses, but I do occasionally go to a race. And it is absolutely true. It is fun to put a bet on a horse because you're invested in that horse. And that is fine for most people. And I think that sort of betting, we should absolutely make sure that it is not intrusively checked and that if somebody wins, you can bet again and you can try your luck again, and that all of those types of betting we are not stopping, and that the fun that people have at racecourses, and the majority of people are having harmless fun, is not what we are stopping. The majority of gambling problems stem from people chasing their losses and spending more than they can afford. And I think I've heard that too about gambling addiction, although again, I'm not an expert, that ultimately people get most exciting betting more if they have lost something. And we've also heard, in fact, when people are winning, they are sometimes excluded from betting more. And that is something that is absolutely not right. We Liberal Democrats, and here we go because I also think we might sort of add something to this debate, would adopt a public health approach to gambling legislation. We propose that there be a soft cap on gambling losses set at £100 per month. This proposed cap is much higher than the vast majority of gamblers lose in a month, so occasional gamblers would not be affected in any way and would not appear on any database. As I've said, many gambling companies already require financial data to be able to open an account, so for many who reach the £100 cap, no additional information would be required. If someone wishes to bet beyond that loss limit, then they would be required to provide financial data to show that they can afford to do so. These affordability checks would be run separately from any individual gambling company. There would be confidential sharing of data between these different gambling companies so that an individual couldn't get close to the cap with several companies at the same time. We need a single, independently run system of affordability checks that treats people with dignity. Data collected for this purpose would be held securely and confidentially and solely for this purpose. These affordability checks would also not apply to cash gambling, for example, at horse racing. So there are some proposals that the Minister might have a look at, because it is important that there is a reform, but it is also important that we get this right, and it is particularly important to me that such a wonderful facility like Bath Racecourse is not going to be affected by a sort of big hammer approach to tackle a problem that will have unintended consequences that would put wonderful community facilities like Bath Racecourse out of business. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Healy, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak in this debate, and I'm grateful to the member for Neath for introducing it. I'm even more grateful to the more than 100,000 people who signed this petition. It reached 100,000 calling for this debate in only 27 days, and 1,200 of those signatures are from my Newmarket constituency. My constituency is called West Suffolk, but the vast majority of them from Newmarket in West Suffolk. And not only does it feel like being at the start of a horse race surrounded by so many colleagues because it is so busy in here today, I've been contacted by other members, including 2 ministers who wanted to speak but can't. The former Chancellor, the member for Stratford, wants to speak and can't. This is a huge issue, and I don't want to leave the Minister with the impression that this is a side issue. This is absolutely central to the future of horse racing, and we are making a mistake, and we must stop, and we must start again. And I want to set out why. I bow to no one in caring for and having a regard to the problems of gambling harms. I have seen it for myself. I've spoken to those who have lost children. As the Culture Secretary, I brought in the limits on fob teas far below the recommended rate. I overruled the official advice to bring in the £2 limit with the support of the member for Swansea East, the member for Chimford Woodford Green. We worked together on that. I care deeply about, and I understand both as former Culture Secretary and former Health Secretary, I understand gambling harms. But these proposals, as they're being brought in, are going to make that problem worse. The PwC report recently published showed that the amount staked by UK online gamblers on the unregulated market in 2020 had doubled to 2.8 billion from the previous 1 to 2 years. In December 22, over 250,000 people visited unregulated black market sites compared to only 80,000 during the same month the previous year. Now, this has a huge impact on horse racing, which I'll come on to, but it also has a huge impact on gambling-related harm. Online casinos, games of chance rather than games of skill, these are a serious problem that needs addressing. And I would recommend that the limits being proposed in some of the proposals of £5 are themselves reduced to £2. I think we should be extremely tough on games of chance, which are programmed algorithmically to ensure people lose money. And I don't think anybody in this debate would oppose the introduction of measures to resist those types of addictions for addictions they are. So I bow to nobody in my support for measures to tackle problem gambling, but I'm afraid to say I am convinced, having looked at the evidence, that bringing in these measures, as they are not just proposed but being brought in, is increasing, not decreasing, gambling harms. And we should not fall for the old adage of, we have a problem, we must do something, this is something, therefore we must do it. I'm afraid to say the current proposals are going to lead to worse problems, not better. Many of the offshore firms explicitly target those signed up to the GamStop service. They explicitly target them. And there is a grim irony that the regulator and government are, unfortunately, contributing to a worse problem. Now, a couple of members have mentioned that these checks have already been introduced by the industry, and the member for me said they've been introduced voluntarily already. I'm afraid I don't think that's true. The gambling industry, for which I hold absolutely no regard, the gambling industry are introducing checks now in the shadow of expected future regulation because they know about the Gambling Commission, they're regulated by the Gambling Commission. These things aren't being brought in voluntarily, they're being brought in because the gambling companies think that this regulation is coming down the track. So we're already seeing the negative impact in terms, as we've seen, of the uptake of black market offshore gambling, and we're already seeing the impact on the horse racing industry. Now, I am incredibly lucky to represent Newmarket. Horse racing is the UK's second largest sport, 5 million racegoers annually, over 4 billion for the economy, untold soft power. In Newmarket, 7,000 people employed in and around horse racing, £250 million into the local economy. And obviously, in addition to all of that, the joy that so many have spoken about. But we know that 26% of those betting have already experienced an affordability check ahead of these proposals officially coming in. And we've seen that the turnover, on racing fell by 900 million, the betting turnover on racing in 2022-23. The financial impact on the horse racing industry is already happening. And we already know that prize money is going up in the rest of the world and is incredibly tight in the United Kingdom. This has the biggest impact on the small racecourses, but it even has an impact in Newmarket, which of course hosts the two finest racecourses in the world. And I certainly won't have that challenge, but I'll give way.
The industry estimates this is going to cost them £50 million. Does he agree with me that if we could separate the challenges of problem gambling from the joy and importance of horse racing, which employs 80,000 people, then perhaps there is progress possible, but at the moment that's not clear?
Absolutely, and horse racing already has its own legislative framework. It has since Churchill brought in the tote. There is already in law a definition of and separation of horse racing, and I think that I would recommend to the government that they separate out games of chance where there is no skill, there is guaranteed loss, from horse racing, which is one of this country's finest achievements and is a joy to so many. I also want to come on to this point about frictionless. We've heard a lot about frictionless. I was thrilled when the Minister himself said that checks will be frictionless. He said it at the dispatch box, he said it here, he said it in the white paper. And here I've come to a slightly, what I may say, is a constitutional point. The Gambling Commission have interpreted the Minister saying checks will be frictionless as frictionless for the vast majority. Well, that is different. These checks should be frictionless if they're going to happen at all. The Minister has committed to that. That is government policy. And yet we have a regulator wrongly misinterpreting frictionless as frictionless for the vast majority. It is a distinct problem. And I also ask this question. If it's going to be frictionless, it has to be based on data that people have already consented to be publicly available. Because if somebody's going to look at one's bank account details, then there has to be friction because you need permission to be able to look at those details. So there's already a problem with implementing frictionless checks. And I also come on to the point which my honourable friend, the member for Swansea East made, about it's difficult to see why people would worry about these checks. Why would they go to online sites and that are unregulated? Well, there's two responses to that. The first is because people fear the government looking into their financial affairs. And secondly, a practical point, it is happening. It is happening, and so that is how people are responding to these proposals. I know that it's happening amongst my constituents because on the doorsteps they tell me. They are changing the way they place bets because of fears of what the government is going to look at. And so in this place, we need to recognise reality when it's happening. We can't just wish away the behavioural response of people, which is making the tackling of problem gambling worse rather than betting. So, as any jockey knows when a race is going wrong. I surely do. And so I say to the Minister, it is time to return to the stalls and, with this one, to start again.
Blomfield.
Edward, can I join with others in congratulating my honourable friendly member for Neath for the thoughtful and balanced way that she introduced this debate. And I found it fascinating that so many of the contributions have been about the horse racing industry. I had to check back on the petition, actually, because it barely mentions the horse racing industry, just in the last line, as an afterthought. And we would all want to defend and protect the horse racing industry, but I fear that in this debate, it's being used as a wedge by a gambling industry which is looking for an area where there's great affection in order to prevent something which is doing much wider harm. And I will indeed.
I apologise for intervening on him, but this has been the case all along in all of the inquiries, is that the reality is the slots, the fast gambling, the speed of all those chases is really where the damage lies, not in something that takes about 4 or 5 minutes to finish. It's all about the speed of gambling and the incentive to gamble quickly, quietly, and in the darkness of your own room.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend in this context for his intervention, because he's done such good work on this issue, and on this point he's absolutely right. I've become involved only over the last 6 years or so in issues around gambling reform, and as a result of the death of one of my constituents, Jack Ritchie, as a result of gambling addiction. And what I learnt from the tragedy of Jack's death was that people so often don't take their lives because they're overwhelmed by gambling debt, but they're overwhelmed by the addiction itself. And Jack's parents were very clear to me when I talked to them, and it again echoes a point that the Right Honourable Member for Chingford made earlier, that had there been checks and balances, preventative measures in place at an early stage on Jack's journey into addiction, it could have transformed the tragic outcome that they saw when he took his life. And of course, Jack isn't alone. According to Public Health England, over 400 people take their lives each year as a result of gambling. And a recent Gambling Commission survey that I think has been mentioned earlier found that 2.5% of the population, over 1.5 million people, score over 8 on the Problem Gambling Severity Index. I will indeed.
He's repeated this line that over 400 people a year die of suicide as a result of gambling, a figure that's been discredited many times that the Gambling Commission certainly would not align themselves with. So can he tell us how he's arrived at that particular figure, the methodology he's gone through to arrive at that particular figure? Because I think when he does explain that, he'll realise it is a discredited figure.
Well, I was happy to take an intervention in contrast with the Honourable Member's approach earlier, but I was simply citing the figures that are provided by Public Health England, and I respect Public Health England as I'm sure... No, I won't. No, I'm prepared to accept the figures from a established, respectable national body. And no, I don't think this is a... I'm very happy just to get on with it, because the point that I was seeking to make is that gambling addiction is a health issue. I mean, very shortly the NHS are opening a gambling harm clinic in my constituency. Joins a network of 15 across the country, tackling the serious problem of gambling addiction. And you know, when honourable members have commented earlier, you know, what is the difference? What requires an intervention? What's the difference between going out and spending £150 on a meal or on other shopping or other leisure activities? Well, I don't see the NHS treating those activities as a serious health issue in the way that they are with gambling addiction. I know he's the former health secretary, thank you.
I was the Secretary of State who introduced those gambling clinics. There was one beforehand. But will he address this question of to what extent do we know that those gambling harms are related to betting on horse racing as opposed to these games of chance which are so aggressive and where the algorithms are designed for addiction and to promote addiction?
Well, I'm happy to have taken that intervention because I wasn't seeking to make that point. I was recognising in my earlier comment about the way in which horse racing is being used as a wedge issue to tackle a different problem, echoed by the Right Honourable Member for Chingford, echoed by the comments that my honourable friend for Swansea East made earlier. There is a distinction, and don't let horse racing be used to undermine affordability checks which are needed in a different context. Now, I think that affordability checks, the point I was making was that if this is a health issue, then we need a prevention strategy, just as we have with other health problems. And I commend the government for the prevention strategy that they have developed with the gambling white paper. And affordability checks are an important part of that strategy. But it's regrettable that the debate around them is generating, as it has today, more heat than light. I can understand why, beyond racing, the gambling industry is keen to avoid checks. Yeah. Now, as, again, my Honourable friend, the member for Swansea East, has pointed out, the Gambling Commission research from the patterns of play data confirms that the most profitable 1% of accounts make for 70.4% of gross gambling yield. Those are disproportionate profits derived from small numbers of players who in many cases are gambling much more than they can afford to lose, and people who need to be protected. And we know that harm can happen at relatively low levels of spend, so it's important that affordability checks are set low enough to prevent harm. I do understand the fears behind the petition, and I do think it's important that we spend time, and in fact other colleagues have, on underlining how unobtrusive checks can, and I'm confident will be. Affordability checks aren't anything new, and contrary to suggestions from the industry, background checks on financial vulnerability could be frictionless, making use of already available data that, and let's remember, and the point has been made, data that is already used by the industry itself to monitor accounts, and in some cases use that to withhold winnings from players, to regulate their losses. So the data is there that the industry are willing to use in one context. Well, then why not in this context too? And we know that in the case of enhanced checks, and I'll take the point that was made earlier, only 0.3% of account holders would be expected to provide additional information. It's a tiny number in relation to the benefit that could be achieved through introducing the checks. The vast majority can be done passively, as I've said, using information in the public domain or required for registering an account. And it was a point that my honourable friend, the member Leith, made in her opening comments. I think it's also important that checks should be done by independent, reputable third parties regulated by the FCA, and we should bear that in mind too. I just wanted to make a brief comment on the black market argument that started to come up. Now, this is the last refuge of rogues, really. When the tobacco industry had run out of every other argument to stop regulation, they said, what about the black market? Don't do anything to us, it'll force people to turn to black market smokers. And they didn't. I mean, we have seen a successful public health strategy in relation to tobacco. Payday lenders did it too, when the affordability checks were introduced in their sector. And we've not seen a significant movement of lending from payday lenders to black market loan sharks. So claims about potential growth of the black market following more stringent regulation have been successfully challenged, including by the Gambling Commission, whose powers to address the issue of illegal sites will be further strengthened by provisions in the Criminal Justice Bill. And I understand the difficulties in regulation in the online world. We are facing rogue operators across the online world, but if we're prepared to try to tackle them in other spheres, why not in terms of online gambling? So I think that affordability checks, Sir Edward, will play an important role. They must be set independently rather than by the industry. They should be set at a level which will protect those needing them most. And I recognise that many people enjoy betting safely and without harm, and we can and should ensure that affordability checks are frictionless, except in the most extreme circumstances. We can't lose sight of the fact that affordability checks are about protecting people from harm and ensuring that the gambling industry is regulated in the right way, because left to its own devices, I note the point that were made about some things that have already been happening. They're happening because the industry knows that change is coming. Left to its own devices, we would never have seen these sort of measures.
Thank you, Sir Edward. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I refer the committee to my entries in the register of members' interests. I also proudly claim to be the Member of Parliament for the Cheltenham Racecourse and also co-chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group, along with the Honourable Member for St Helens North. But I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint the last speaker, because I am going to speak mainly about horse racing. And I think, as the Member of Parliament for the race course, which brings in, I think the last estimate was £278 million to the local economy in just 4 days. And those 4 days are coming up very soon. So I think I'd be neglecting my duties if I did not speak from a horse racing point of view. I want to welcome and thank the Minister for always being available for meetings to discuss this and always being willing to come to these debates. I don't think he's particularly enjoys them anymore, but he always turns up at them and always listens. So I want to thank him for everything he's doing on this. And I do recognise that this issue was dropped on him by previous ministers, and for that he has my deepest sympathy. I want to point out the relationship between betting and horse racing. It's not always obvious. The figure, of course, varies, but something like 40% of racing's income comes from betting companies in terms of levy, media rights and sponsorship. I also want to explode a myth that horse racing is this rich sport. It's referred to as the sport of kings, and of course we have had a number of monarchs who have taken deep interest in horse racing. So from that point of view, it's the sport of kings. But it is a very poorly funded sport. If we look at the top 1%, then maybe there's a lot of money there. But if we look at the whole pyramid, as it were, we find that it actually is not very well funded at all. Just yesterday, if we look at prize money, horse race owners actually are the unsung heroes in racing, because they lose, and I'm not one of them, they lose so much money. I'm surprised that they continue at all, but they do. And I just want to quote some figures from yesterday's racing. At Hereford, the average prize money was £4,342. Now, not many miles away in Ireland, at Naas, the average prize money was £12,479. 2 races in France yesterday averaged 27,000, and in Hong Kong, that's almost off the scale, the average was 154,620. So we can see how very poorly horse racing is funded in this country, and that has a knock-on effect on stable staff and on jockeys and on trainers, who are all far from rich, quite the reverse, believe me. But British racing, while it's the best in the world, is probably almost the poorest funding in the world. Now, the reason I make these points is that racing cannot take any more further financial setbacks. And that is why racing and betting have come together as never before on this issue. They know, the greatest ever threats to their existence that have ever been in place. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. And imagine the UK without the Grand National, the Derby, Royal Ascot, the Cheltenham Gold Cup. These are iconic races, and it would not be the same without those magnificent races. And I have to say that changes in the levy, which are being discussed at the moment, would not compensate for the loss which racing could face as a result of these affordability checks. Quite the reverse. It would be seen, to use an old political phrase, a double whammy. I also then move on to the... certainly.
What do you think about the boat race, Wimbledon, the Calcutta Cup? I had to mention it. None of those are funded by the gambling industry, and yet they survive.
Well, they're very, very different. I think I'm right in saying, and people more experienced might correct me, but across the world, I think horse racing is funded by gambling companies. I'm not fully aware of how other sports are funded, so I'll have to sort of ask him to excuse me in that respect. I've always been in favour of racing expanding its income stream and getting more and more sponsorship, which it does do a lot of work on that. So I would be very happy to see racing go down that. But it is nowhere near there yet, not by any means. There's also the philosophical aspect of this, as we've heard. A Conservative government actually should not be telling people how much money they should spend. And I also would be very keen, though, to recognise that we do need to help problem gamblers. But I really think we should be targeting people who are possibly liable to become addicted to gambling, rather than people who spend too much on gambling, because if we try and stop people who spend too much on gambling, we then into the philosophy of it. What about people who spend too much on alcohol? What about people who get addicted to shopping? Some people do get addicted to shopping, and the question was asked earlier, we don't see the health service dealing with those people. Well, perhaps we should. Perhaps we should, rather than just focusing on one aspect of society, in other words, gambling. Perhaps that's a criticism of the health service. It's not something to be proud of. We should be looking at people who've got other addictions. And people with addictions often have other problems as well. And I do speak from some knowledge on this. People with addictions do have other problems as well. So rather than saying, oh, you can spend £100 a month but not £200 a month, that does not address people with addictions. We should be working out systems that actually do address those who are in real danger. So I'm not going to speak for very long. I am going to respect your 10-minute guidance, Sir Edward. My suggestions then would be that we should halt this process. My honourable friend, the member for Shipley, said perhaps the government's invested too much capital in it. Well, not as much capital as they invested in HS2, and they managed to pull that. Eventually, but quite rightly. So I do suggest that we take a step back from this, because we are risking destroying a betting industry, but far more importantly, from my point of view, destroying the second most popular sport in the United Kingdom. Certainly, yeah.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's making a fantastic speech. And one of the few members in this chamber today that doesn't have a horse track in my constituency of Old Bexley and Sidcup. But my constituents are very passionate about this issue because, like me, they believe in personal responsibility. They believe in freedom. And they like a day at the races. They like a day at the races. And we shouldn't apologise for these issues. And as he does represent the area of Cheltenham, I wonder if he does agree with me that these checks, as designed and as being used voluntarily so far, are deeply flawed. And actually, on weeks like Cheltenham, they could see people forced into the black market on the first day if they've had a bad day's betting.
Well, my friend's absolutely right. The black market is a real threat. And I'm afraid the tobacco industry, yes, they may have made a lot of it, but it was actually because people were turning to the black market. You know, it can't be denied. A committee I chaired years ago looked into that in some detail. And, of course, people did go to the black market, and they're likely to go to the black market through wanting to have a frictionless bet that doesn't cause them a load of trouble. They're already doing it, Sir Edward. It is already happening. We're getting evidence of that regularly. Yeah, my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful, and as Emily speaks up very well for the racing industry. Was he surprised, like me, to hear the SNP appear to be arguing that they don't want any income for racecourses from the gambling industry? Would he agree with me that the people at Perth and Musselburgh and Hamilton and Ayr and Kelso will be very interested to hear that that seems to be the view of the SNP?
Well, my honourable friend tempts me to go down a road I'm not quite sure I want to go down. The SNP are very capable of speaking for themselves. I'm coming up towards my 2 minutes. Did the honourable member wish to? Yep.
I was saying there has to be an equitable form of funding all other sports. You can't just focus on horses and say it's the only one to benefit from it. There are other sports enjoyed throughout the United Kingdom.
OK, I think I did answer that before, Sir Edward. So what I'm saying to the government is, look, we all want to protect vulnerable people. We do not want anybody who is vulnerable to addiction. You know, if we talk about the analogy I always use, is if we go in a pub. Now, the pub makes its money through selling alcoholic drinks to people, but it doesn't want alcoholics in there. It doesn't want people who are drunk in there. They want people who enjoy a drink without causing any problems to themselves or to anybody else. So that's the analogy I would use. So I would suggest to the government, I would say to the government, this is deeply unpopular in the racing industry, deeply unpopular in the betting industry. Many, many colleagues of my own party and other parties are very, very concerned about this. We're not saying let's not take measures to help vulnerable people. Of course we should. But this is not the way to do it. So I would ask the Minister to have a word with the Gambling Commission and put a halt to the pressure they appear to be putting on companies who are already taking steps, and we are already seeing the loss of income to horse racing. Say to them, hold it a minute, hold your horses, you might say, hold it for a minute, let's have a rethink on this. I would suggest to the Minister, let's get interested parties around the table. I think that suggestion was made earlier. Let's not rush this. let's think about how we do it properly. As I say, the Minister is not to blame for this. He's had it dumped on him. But, Minister, please go back to the people who are pressing this policy from wherever in the Conservative Party they are, and let's say, this is a dangerous policy, it will not work, there's a lot of opposition within our own party to it. Let's get people who know what they're talking about round a table, let's talk about it, and let's see what progress we can make working together.
Thank you, Sir Edward. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I was worried that I was going to be declared a non-runner, but I'm glad to get under orders, having listened to numerous of my colleagues. And I want to say at the outset as well, in the Minister and the Shadow Minister, I think we're very fortunate, those of us who have an interest in this topic from whatever perspective, but also a wider interest in sport, that we have two people who are engaged, who are open to discussion, and who are very involved in every aspect of their brief, and we're very lucky to have that. In fact, I saw the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Minister, yesterday, and I thought to myself, he is the great white hope for the Conservative Party. He appeared on our television screens and received a rapturous applause and foot-stomping and acclamation on Merseyside. I'm sure it was coincidental that it was at Wembley presenting Jurgen Klopp and Virgil van Dijk with the League Cup as part of the presentation party. I want to draw attention to my declaration in the Register of Interest, and I always say at this point that, having owned horses and gambled on horses, I have given a lot more to racing and betting than it will ever give me. But I'm happy to draw I will.
If he reminds me, can I also draw the House's attention to my register? I'm lucky to be strongly supported. I've been strongly supported by those in Newmarket.
Delighted to give the Right Honourable Gentleman the opportunity. And I want to be emphatic about this so we're very clear. I am here to speak on behalf of Haydock Park Racecourse in my constituency in St Helens. I am here to speak up for the 100,000 people who signed this petition, decent, honourable, good taxpayers in this country who have a concern about this and a love for horse racing, and to say emphatically that the whole of the horse racing industry, if I might cheekily say, not an industry that is widely known for its unanimity on issues, one might gently say, the whole of British horse racing speaks with one voice on this issue and its concerns on this issue. And I'm the co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group with my colleague from Tewkesbury, and this is an interest and an issue that unites people in all parties and across the House. Look, I want to step back a little bit and look at the bigger issues. Many of the points that I would wish to have been made already, and I furiously agree with the honourable gentleman from Shipley on this, as indeed I do, I fear, on too many issues, but certainly on this, and he made a lot of the points that I wish to. Look, I want to say three things.
Will you give way?
I will, of course.
That admission is far more damaging for his reputation than it is for mine.
Indeed, I fear it was mutually assured destruction, Sir George. Look, I want to say three things. This is bad policy, both in terms of the concept and the philosophy behind it, the purpose and indeed the efficacy of it in addressing that purported reason. Secondly, the detrimental, disproportionate and frankly existential impact this will have on British horse racing. And then thirdly, I think what government, racing and betting can do to try to fix this, work together and address their respective challenges. Look, having praised the Minister, I don't wish to bury him, but this isn't racing's fault. It's not betting's fault. It's not even the Gambling Commission's fault. They haven't led us to this. It's the government that has led us to this. It's bad policy by any objective measure, and it's hard to find any objective measure because this is not evidence-based. It's incoherent, and at many levels it's in response to anecdote and to emotion. I find it incredible that as an old-fashioned working-class Labour man I say this, but this is massive government overreach and infringement on the right of the individual. no other legal leisure activity in the UK has the government set out spending limits in this fashion. I think net loss is a terrible barometer. It takes no account of the hugely different ranges of disposable income that individuals have. And a floated £500 trigger per 365 rolling days a year, it's equivalent to £1.37 a day. I think the Honourable Lady opposite mentioned that figure earlier. I mean, that's the equivalent of doing the English Lotto, the Euro Millions and a scratch card a week. And if the purpose is to tackle problem gambling, I think it's an odd solution. I think tools that already exist, like self-exclusion and deposit limits, those measures are more effective, and if necessary, a conversation can take place with betting about how they can be strengthened. And ultimately, I feel, and I do speak with experience of this, friends, family whose lives have been devastated by addiction. But it's about the individual and their behaviour, and it's about responsibility. If you want to gamble, you will find a way to gamble. And the point about the black market is, I respectfully say, an important one. Because if you want to gamble a lot, you'll be able to gamble a lot. Now, we're not talking about the old fella in the pub who takes a friendly bet on a Saturday. This is about organised crime. This is about national security. This is about the use of technology through drones flying over our race courses, through manipulation of data, through all of those things that the sport has to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to prevent becoming something that gets out of control. And we're warning about this. The Racing Post front page today made very clear the potential consequences of this. Thousands of people, millions of pounds, that's the scale that we're talking about. And that leads me on to the point about racing having a specific problem. Look, we don't have to imagine the impact of this, because de facto checks are happening and having an impact now. And racing has a specific problem because of the unique, inextricable relationship that we have with betting through the levy. And it is creating a funding crisis for our sport. Look, like all sports, racing is facing economic headwinds that make it difficult. But it's this almost, if not deliberate, certainly careless decision to hurt betting revenue, as is set out in black and white in the government's white paper. The £900 million reduction in horse racing betting revenue means a direct hit of £50 million to racing, and that's the genesis of this problem. The right honourable gentleman from Chingford, who's no longer in this place, he pleaded in aid the on-the-rail men, the course bookies, and I've been a great defender of those, along with so many others, and there is nothing better than being on a race course and having a bet in the ring, looking at the various odds and enjoying the fun of the spectacle of well, we don't have the tic-tac anymore, but certainly the theatre of on-course betting. It generated £120 million in turnover last year. Off-course betting generated £3 billion in revenue last year. We're talking about a £5 billion industry. So if you're going to come to a debate like this and propose solutions, they have to be serious ones based on numbers and based on figures. And it's this reduction to the levy that will result from less betting on racing and have a resultant loss in the value of media rights. And this, of course, has a consequential impact on prize money. Race courses that face a very, very difficult environment already, and participants, owners and trainers who feel frustrated about the level of prize money. It risks the sustainability of our courses and racing yards, and that means closures and job losses. And you very quickly put racing in a death spiral, and we've already seen the impact on punters. I can attest to this. Racing becomes a less attractive product. Bookies have removed best odds guarantee, and you can hardly get a bet on. Because racing is part of a delicate ecosystem. We're not quite an endangered species, but this essentially puts a motorway through our habitat. And it's funny sometimes I hear when I take part in these debates that somehow it's a pro-bookie approach or one's in the pocket of the gambling industry. The Shadow Minister represents a constituency like mine, a very proud working class constituency. She's from the same Labour Party, a bit of the Labour Party as me, the sort of sensible bit of it that's rooted in communities. My relationship with the bookies is adversarial. I want to beat the bookies. That's the whole point of gambling. I want to take money from them. So it's as the honourable gentleman from Shipley says, I rail against sometimes the bookies, but it doesn't mean that I don't understand the vital contribution that they make and that they play in horse racing. So look, to bring that together, I suppose, what is it that the government, racing and gambling can do together? Well, look, the government should bin this idea, preferably permanently, but certainly until the promised frictionless element is proven to be just that. In my view, generally, government should ensure that racing and betting are well run, well regulated and fair, that they continue providing jobs and contributing to the economy. And on racing specifically, it should recognise the huge impact in communities and the wonderful enhancement it is to the UK at home and abroad. And other than that, they should butt out, and the Minister should enjoy an odd day at the racing. But other than that, government should let those two respective industries get on with it. And here's the key point arising from this, because I've heard some of the contributions made, and well-intentioned as they are, from people who have a genuine love of horse racing. They do need to be challenged, because racing and betting have got to work together, as they have on this issue and as they need to on other issues. Racing does need to recognise it receives more now from betting than ever before, through levy and media rights, sponsorship and advertising. And I just add a note of caution. I think seeking more from levy reform when turnover on betting on racing is reducing, even if one was to incorporate international racing, it's arguably a short-term fix that's not sustainable in the long term. We don't want to be penny-wise and pound-foolish, taking money in the front door but losing it out the back. But betting, for its part, needs to continue and enhance to help promote racing, and it does need to recognise and support the sport's unique position and the skill, the talent, and indeed the people involved that makes it a special and precious product. And it needs to give the punter a fair price, and it needs to give us a chance to beat them now and then, and it needs to pay us out when we do. Because we talk a lot about the provider in terms of the bookies, we talk a lot about the recipient in terms of horse racing, but what about the benefactor? And that's the punter, and that's the man and woman that I consider myself very much fundamentally a part of and a spokesperson for. Because racing should never be able to, and I'll bring my remarks to a conclusion, racing should never be afraid to say that gambling is a huge and enjoyable part of our sport. People like me love the mechanics of it, the breeding, the form, the going, the word that you get from Ireland on a big day. But others come for the name, the colours, the numbers, and so we need to be very careful about putting forward this argument about chance as well. Look, there's a reason we're the second biggest spectator sport. We need to be confident and clear about that. We need to be strategic and sensible. And in this House, like the country as a whole, we need to win friends and fans and exert influence. I don't think that's beyond that, because as you know, Sir George, racing is simultaneously the sport of kings and the pursuit of the masses. And who else can claim that?
David Mundell.
Thank you, Sir George. And it's a great pleasure, actually, to follow the honourable gentleman, who's a much greater expert on this issue than I am. But I do make no apology for speaking up for horse racing and indeed the equestrian industry more generally in this debate, because in a constituency like mine, it is an extremely important to the local economy. I represent the largest rural constituency in the United Kingdom outside the Highlands. That constituency doesn't have a functioning racecourse, but it does border courses in Hexham, Carlisle, Hamilton, Kelso and Ayr, and therefore it has many training yards, it has breeders, it has vets, it has all farriers, jockeys, all the people who are connected with an equestrian sport. And those people are extremely concerned about this proposal and the impact that it will have on the industry. And one of the opportunities of this debate is to air those concerns. And I think that's what, along with fellow members who set out very important points, already is what we should be doing this evening. The 2 points I most want to focus on are the inappropriateness of any one-size-fits-all approach. And I think there has been a consensus, at least emerging, that the approach towards games of chance and games of skill should be different, and it's not appropriate to treat them the same. It's not the same going to a race course as it is playing a game of roulette on your phone. And then the issue of the frictionless checks and the reality of those checks and how possible they are. I've already, and it's been commented on how helpful the Minister has been in meeting MPs with concerns, but I've already drawn the Minister's attention to a book, volume 1 of a series of books, indeed written by my constituent William Morgan, called The Strongholds of Satan. And that is a series of books which set out to detail every racecourse that has previously existed in the UK. And the title, Strongholds of Satan, comes from how racecourses were previously described when before the rise of football, racing was a potent combination of national sport, fair, local holiday and opportunity to gamble. And therefore religious leaders were outraged and politicians were constantly trying to restrain all the shenanigans among the crowds, the gamblers and the horse owners. And I particularly commended the Minister to the chapter which is called The Regulation of Racing. And in that chapter, Mr. Morgan sets out how from 1654, government has sought to regulate and interfere with racing. In fact, the first act by the then Cromwellian government was to ban it completely, not because it had any moral or other concern, but it didn't want to bring crowds of people together who could ferment against the government. But the book goes on to set out other pieces of legislation. 1740, an act to restrain and prevent the excessive increase of horse races and more effectual preventing of excessive and deceitful gaming. And so it goes on through the next nearly 300 years. But what that chapter does, which I'm not going to set out in full, is to show that many of the measures that were brought forward had completely unintended consequences. And what happened, as we've speculated on already in this debate, is that the owners, the punters, the racecourse proprietors, the nefarious elements, they changed their practices to accommodate these legislative proposals. And that, I think, is a very significant concern about what is being proposed. And the former Culture Secretary set out the concerns about illegal betting, black market betting taking place. And I think that we should look very clearly at what the possibility of these consequences, and particularly as the British Horse Racing Association have set out, the proportionality of what is being proposed. I think it's also clear that many people don't have confidence, and many constituents have been in touch with me, don't have confidence in the concept of the frictionless check. And if the Minister, in his closing remarks, can set out how people could have confidence in that it will not be intrusive into their affairs. Yes.
I thank my little friend for giving way. Can I just add into that, one of the potential consequences that I do fear may come out of this is actually the impact on the elderly and in particular isolation. So when I was a student, I worked part-time in a bookmaker's to help pay for my fees and upkeep. It helped me fall in love with horse racing. But actually one of the things that I used to see day in, day out was actually elderly people that would bet very small stakes, but actually would fear very much the intrusiveness of these checks and actually being caught up in this trap, and it may fuel some kind of isolation from their day-to-day experiences.
Well, I take very much on board what my honourable friend says, and I can read to him a quote from my constituent Alexander McLean, who said to me, "I bet on sport, and I find it extremely offensive that someone should dictate how I should spend the money that I've already paid tax on. I'm 71 years old. I have no dependents. My bills have been paid. I have enough money stashed away to pay for my funeral. Why is the government subjecting me to this?" And he goes on to say he, of course, agrees that there are people who find themselves in tragic situations with a gambling addiction. But as the Honourable Lady from Bath said, it is a sledgehammer to crack a nut in this regard. And I'm sure that Mr McLean will be very pleased to have heard my honourable friend from Shipley speak up for punters, and particularly, as again my honourable friend has said, for older punters who are taking a responsible attitude. Now, that doesn't mean that the issues and concerns which have been very eloquently raised by the honourable lady from Swansea East and my right honourable friend from Chingford should not be considered. Of course they should be. But it's clear that in relation to the horse racing industry, to the whole equestrian community, the government have got it wrong on this, and they do need to take a step back and review how they can effectively continue to support the horse racing industry and equestrian sector, whilst at the same time taking on board the serious concerns that there are in relation to the regulation and operation of certain games of chance. And that would be my message to the government. Many people may think that this estate is a stronghold of Satan, but it's clear that there are many people here who do have a genuine concern and support for the industry, know how important it is to their local economies and communities, and we should be doing everything to support it, not bringing in measures that potentially completely and utterly undermine it.
Kenny McCaskill. Thank you, Sir John. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. As is quite clear from the speeches that have been made so far, there are two aspects to this debate. There's the question of the regulation of gambling, and there's the question of the protection of horse racing. The first, I certainly think, does require action because there is a significant social problem, as I'll come on to, and others, especially the member for Neath, eloquently made. The second is that there is a debate between the gambling industry and indeed horse racing, and I think we have to differentiate there. The gambling industry, after all, much of it is now online, much of it is now based in Gibraltar. They're not even paying taxes, whereas the horse racing industry is indigenous. It is also part, and reference was made about horse racing being funded by the gambling industry. Yes, that is to some extent a historical anachronism. It was no doubt done deliberately so that people wouldn't see gambling going into the black market, into other unregulated aspects, whether it was pitch and toss, whether it was dog fights, whether it was illegal boxing matches. Gambling was ensured that a revenue stream went from gambling into horse racing. And that is fundamental, because the member for Tewkesbury was correctly saying that people might think that horse racing is flush. It is not. I, along with others, declare an interest in having a horse racing within my constituency because I do represent Musselburgh. Musselburgh has had its challenges. Musselburgh has had to be sold and has now been brought by Chester. Indeed, at one stage it looked that there might not even be a buyer, because it's not as if people are lining up as they are to buy English Premier League teams or even Scottish Premier League football teams. There have been redundancies there. that I had to interfere with and speak to the management about. They were done reluctantly, and we have had to see it accord to that. So there are challenges in that sector, and some of this, the subliminal aspect by the gambling industry, is to reduce the amount of money that they put into horse racing because they don't have the same involvement in funding football or anything else other than the money that they make from it. But going back to the primary issue of gambling, there is a problem with gambling. People do suffer, and we have to recognise that. I am not some libertarian that thinks it's all just free market and people have their free will and they can decide. It is a social problem, exactly the same as we have social problems with alcohol and drugs. And we don't unregulate them. We don't say consume what you like. We make sure that we know what the product is. We make sure that we try and encourage to be supervised. We make sure that we tax it and regulate it. We can argue, and I certainly argue, that we go too much too far on drugs and not sometimes far enough on alcohol. But we have to make sure that we regulate. And what we have to recognise with gambling is it has transformed. As a child of the 60s, gambling was basically done in a bookies. That was a foreboding, intimidating place into which working men went, perhaps in a flat cap, which women would not be seen in, which respectable men would probably not wish to be seen going into. They kept very limited hours, and indeed in some ways, certainly when I was young, they almost seemed quite intimidatory in many ways. I now have a flat in Dunbar, and I look across the high street, and there is a bookies. And it is open early in the morning, and it is open until late at night, and people of all ages, genders, ethnicities are going in. Far too many, I have to say, much as I'm not opposing people enjoying a flutter, as I'll come on to say. So the whole nature of the industry has changed. I remember being briefed as Justice Secretary by Dr. Reith from Glasgow, who is a world expert in gambling and how gambling has changed because of the nature of how it is done. People can now literally lose not just their shirt, they can lose their house overnight if you've got multiple credit cards. So there does have to be regulation. The nature of who gambled has also changed because ethnic minorities who might not have gone into the working class, working man's bookies are now going elsewhere. I remember hearing in Scotland we had significant difficulties with Polish and East Europeans who were working in the casinos and actually socialised in the casinos and therefore actually developing a gambling problem in the casinos because that was where they hung about. But women and, as I say, people who wouldn't otherwise have gone in. So we have to target and address gambling. I don't disagree with that. I think what we have to do is quite often address supply rather than demand, which is why we have to look at regulation in terms of sponsorship of football teams, the advertisement that goes on television that is basically down your face. You want to watch the football, but are inconvenienced by being told, beckon this, the number of corners, being able to cash in, or all these things. That is entirely separate from horse racing. Yes, gambling is an inextricable part of horse racing. If people do go to a horse race, they do wish to gamble. Some will probably gamble too much and will regret it, but in the main, they will not do so. It is a day out. It's the same in other constituents as it is in my own in Musselburgh. It is an event at which people go to. The Ladies' Day is very colourful, as it will be in all of them, whether in hats or other dresses and whatever. And indeed, people come far and wide. It is part of the local economy. I did say that there had been redundancies, but it still provides both employment there and indeed in the days when it's racing, it provides for the hotels, the guest houses, the hostelries. People make money and there's a supply chain and those who are related to it in terms of providing for the horse racing industry. And if we cripple it, not only do we face the risk that the likes of Musselburgh will close, people will continue to watch horse racing and bet on horse racing, but it will be, as I think the member for Tewkesbury said, it will be the races in Ireland, the races in France, the races in Hong Kong or whatever else, and that's why we have to protect it. That's why, as I say, we have to get the balance right. I remember as Justice Secretary bringing in legislation to actually be quite firm on the sale of alcohol. That's something that I think was correctly done. Equally, I remember being criticised at some stage because I gave the licence back to Murrayfield Stadium. People said, how can you be cracking down on alcohol and yet allow alcohol licence into Murrayfield Stadium? To which I answered that we are not against alcohol, exactly the same as we're not against gambling. What we are is about ensuring that it is carried out in a safe and secure manner, that it is regulated, that people can be protected, sometimes even protected against themselves, which is why I do believe that you do have to take action in these social problems. We are our brother and sister's keeper. And it is, and the result may not have gone the way most members, other than the two of us here from Scotland, perhaps went on Saturday, but it would have been enjoyed. And actually, it was better that people went to the stadium rather than sat in a park drinking cans or bottles and then rushed to the game late on. It was better that they went and had a few drinks and consumed it safely, supervised. That is why, as Justice Secretary and in terms of alcohol legislation in Scotland, we were always very supportive of the on-trade, because we much preferred that people went to a public house where the alcohol industry want to serve you a premium product at a premium price for them, but in a manner that's safe, secure, and that they can benefit from. That is much better than people being sold almost unlimited supplies of high-strength, low-price alcohol from supermarkets or wherever else. And there are corollaries to that with gambling. What we have to do is stop people losing their shirt, never mind their home, by having games of chance, by having puggy machines or whatever sophisticated name goes with them now, that sit in betting shops, that can go online, as I say, literally get a credit card and see their savings disappear. What we cannot do, as I say, is undermine where people can go and have a flutter and enjoy themselves, where it's part of that day out. So, by all means...
Gently say to him, he's making a very interesting speech. Can I just refer him to the comments made by the Honourable Gentleman for St Helens in his speech, when he made clear that without the levy income that horse racing generates from online betting, Musselburgh Racecourse and the other racecourses wouldn't exist for Have a Nice Day Out and a bet at the ring. That actually the income from online gambling for the horse racing industry is absolutely critical for horse racing to continue in this country.
Well, yes, I mean, it's the way I've expressed it. I mean, I think I said at the outset I am conscious of the requirement that Musselburgh and indeed other racecourses have to get that income from the gambling industry. If people now do it more online as opposed to going to the betting shop, even the one opposite me in Dunbar, then that has to be accepted. What we have to do is to have that relationship between the money. What we have to separate are, as I say, the position of gambling that is being sold in every shape or form as it is, as opposed to a entertainment, because that is what horse racing is. It is an entertainment in which gambling is a legitimate part of it, and have to sustain that. Obviously, the industry seeks to make more money out of encouraging people to bet and gamble on football, because they don't put the same money in, other except in terms of shirt advertising or whatever else. It doesn't benefit the grassroots game or any club. So, as I say, I think what the government has to do is to make sure that it does take action that is necessary against gambling, primarily, as I say, not those who are at the turf in places such as that. And I fully accept the point the member's making that how people place a bet now is literally not going into a betting shop, but on their phone, not even on their computer, but provide the protection for what is an industry. It may be an anachronism. You can make an argument that other sports should get the benefit, but I think we are where we are, and we have to recognise that this is where we have been as a society. And on that basis, we have to differentiate between horse racing that does require to be protected, where it is something where we do want to encourage people to participate, because their gambling will be supervised, moderated, and part of a culture, as indeed, as I said, it made reference to drinking in a pub as opposed to drinking in a public park.
Thank you very much, George. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. I congratulate the Honourable Member for Neath for leading off on this debate. She and I usually have discussions about another of my hobbies, which is squash. And I'm here today to talk about another hobby, horse racing. I have a lifelong interest and passion in racing. I have in the past owned legs and hairs of racehorses, not very successful, and at the moment I on the farm at home, we have a broodmare and we have young stock, and I have an ambition to get those horses onto the racecourses, crazy as it may sound. And at the moment, the greater problem is dealing with mud fever rather than probably affordability checks. But affordability checks are very important. And as we're hearing, I don't, like everyone else, there is problem gambling is a major problem. But there is a worry that there is going to be a severe impact of unintended consequences on the funding of horse racing if these affordability checks go forward in their existing form. Now, horse racing is largely funded, as we've heard, through the levy. In recent years, there's been additional funding coming in, whether it's through media rights and through sporting and through sponsorship. But largely speaking, it comes through the horse race betting levy. That came in the early 1960s. I personally think at that time, horse racing government went down the wrong road. It would be better if we had what is known as a pari-mutuel form of gambling, and if that is why, as we've seen from what the honourable friend from Tewkesbury said, why those prize money is so much higher in places like Hong Kong and Japan, which actually are incredibly well-regulated industries as well. And as I said, so horse racing does depend dramatically, to a large degree, on that levy. And it's quite clear from what I see, from the feedback I get, that these affordability checks in their current form will have a serious impact on the take from the levy. And horse racing at the moment, and the funding is, and you look at that prize money, is under real challenge and in real crisis in the UK. And I know my honourable friend from Skipton did say that, Shipley did say that we have the best horse racing in the world, and we do, but we can't, that is increasing in risk of becoming an anachronism. Yeah. And there is a real worry that if we just let this go, that horse racing will wither on the vine in this country. If you look at the horses in training sales from Tattersalls at Newmarket last autumn, horses that traditionally, a lot of those horses would have come out of flat racing, they would have gone into national hunt racing, they would have remained in the UK for racing. They're now actually going all around the world, whether that is to the US, to Australia, and you have got emerging new industries not just in Dubai and the Maiden, as we're seeing at the moment, but also in places like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, which are making a real impact. And a lot of those horses are going to those places. And if you look at the owners of those places, if you look, a lot of British owners are racing out there. And if you watched the racing on Saturday afternoon, a very well-known racing figure, Sir Alex Ferguson. Where was he? He was at Maiden. He wasn't watching his horses run at Kempton. And so that is what I'm worried where we may be heading. I think it's also important to emphasise, and we've heard great stories today about everyone plug for the racecourses that we've got all around the UK and how important they are for their local economies. And that is very true. And actually, one point I would just highlight, which I picked up in the Racing Post over the weekend, it was you had the launch of the weights for the Grand National last week. And one of the articles was saying that actually the Grand National meeting every year, it puts more money into the Liverpool economy than the Eurovision Song Contest did last year. So, and I think that is repeated. Obviously, we're going to see it at Cheltenham, we see it at York, we see it at Goodwood, we see it at those festivals that take place all around the country. And so that is at risk. But the racing supply chain, it extends far beyond that. It extends, as we say, into those training centres as well. It extends into the countryside, onto the studs. It also then, you have places where horses are pre-trained. You also, importantly, have places where horses are retrained. When horses have finished their racing lives, they are retrained for alternative uses and for alternative activities. And so that, it's the tentacles of racing extend a long, long way. It's not just also in the countryside. It's also into the towns and into those licensed betting offices, those LBOs in the high street. And I know the Honourable Lady has a concern about that, but certainly if I look in the town where I represent, there hasn't been a dramatic increase in LBOs, and they are a very important part. If I've misinterpreted the Honourable Lady, I apologise profusely on that, but they are very, very important in those high streets. They tend to have a sort of family feel about them, in that the staff there, and there are actually a lot of women who now work in those shops, it's the good family relationship with the punters in there, and if people start getting sort of out of control very, very quickly, hang on, do you know where you're going on that? So there is that long supply chain. We've also heard about unintrusive and frictionless checks. And the feedback that I get is that they are very, very difficult to actually put into practice in real life. And you see, as I said, you either get the rise of the black market, and as we've heard today, there is the large article at the front of the Racing Post, which has indicated that that is a reality, or a lot of small punters will say, well, I give up, I'm not going to do it. And then that impacts on the levy, and it spirals down to the impact into racing. I think the final point I would just make is there is an element of hypocrisy about this, in that the lottery is not included. And the lottery is great. Actually, it was probably one of the best, if you look at the legacy of the major government. Its impact has been profound and positive. And if I look back when I was growing up, very rarely did we win Olympic gold medals. I can think of listening to David Hemery when he won in 1968 in Mexico. Well, actually, we now win in so many different sports. And that is the direct result of the lottery. So the lottery is a great thing. But it is a game of chance rather than a game of skill. And it's random betting, and it can take over people's lives. And I remember there was one statistic that was put to me that if you gambled on the national lottery every year since Moses was pulled out of the bulrushes, you still wouldn't have won. So that does, I think, just impact that, we need to look at all forms of gambling and betting together. So, George, I'll conclude. A few months ago, I was reading the Racing Post, and one of their leading journalists is Chris Cook, who is the son of Sir Robin Cook, and obviously a former Labour Foreign Secretary. And Chris Cook made a comment that, and it left something with me. He said, you wouldn't have expected a Conservative government to be doing this to horse racing. And I agree with him. And I think on that point, I would just urge my honourable friend, the Minister, who, as we've heard, is listening very, very intently to what we've had some great speeches. I will give way.
Just very, very quickly, because I followed the whole of the debate, this isn't a party political issue. I think it is an issue of all those who feel that horse racing is giving us so much across all communities, and therefore I hope sincerely that the Minister will live. It is a cross-party issue that we all address.
Peter Aldous.
Yes, I would. She's right on that. And I think, but it's a point. It is not party political. But Chris Cook made this point. Robin Cook, if we look back, and I think we can. I think we all saw him on race courses, and I think in his barber jacket down by the final fence. Alex Salmond as well. He is a great punter as well. So it's not party political, but at the moment we have a Conservative government, and I would urge my honourable friend just to take on board what he's hearing this afternoon. Thank you. Freeman.
Thank you, Sir George. They say that all good things come to those who wait, so I hope that the Minister will be able to listen to my words and reassure me that I haven't waited in vain. Thank you for the chance to speak in this debate. When over 40, 50 colleagues turn up in Westminster Hall, for those listening who aren't familiar, we clearly have a problem. And I want to suggest actually that we have two problems here that the Minister has the great honour of helping us deal with. One is the very serious problem of the increasing number of people in this country who find themselves in the turmoil of addictive gambling and online gambling. It's a real problem. And we have a second problem, which is the fragility of the finances of racing, a sport that we all love. And I think the real issue is to try and be clear about those two problems and not to conflate them too much as they have been, and to work out how to deal with them both. But they are both real. Sir George, I have no particular interest in racing other than a long family history and connection. I've been to the races many times, both before and as a Member of Parliament, occasionally as a guest of the BHA, who supported the work that I did creating the Bridge of Hope charity. And I was closely involved with pride with the 2013 bill. My great friend, the member for Suffolk West, Newmarket, and those of us in the industry who made sure that offshore betting was brought within the purview of the levy to give racing a serious boost. I don't have a race track in my constituency yet. I've waited for the Boundary Commission to put Fakenham in my patch for many years, but they refused to do so. But I enjoy the little tracks as much as the big, a point that my great friend, the Honourable Member for Lowestoft, has just made. It's a great pleasure to follow him. My brother trains in California, and I've spent many hours as an underpaid hot walker walking his hots around the track in both California and rather cooler at Woodbine in the winter. And I'm a happy and assiduous attendee at Fakenham races, one of the country's great regional tracks. Sir George, as I think the House knows, I really stand this afternoon because my own family experience. My father was a jump jockey. He rode through the 40s and 50s. He rode for Sir Peter Cazalet. He rode Her late Majesty the Queen Mother's horses. He won the National in the 58 on Mr. Watt and the King George on Lockrow. And he, with my mother, bred Specify, who went on to win the National in 71. But his story is a tragic story because after many head injuries, head injury-induced depression, psychosis, alcohol addiction, gambling, bankruptcy, his life, and indeed my family's, collapsed in 1967. A very familiar tale of many sporting heroes, and it's a story that, thanks to the great work of racing, we don't see anymore because we're better at looking after jockeys, we're better at detecting injuries, head injuries. And it is in that context, really, that I want to just make very clear that I'm rising today really because I take very seriously the unintended consequences, the damage of great sport when not properly regulated, and the damage of gambling and bankruptcy. And I'm not at all relaxed about those dangers. And it is, therefore, I hope, all the more powerful when I join colleagues who've spoken today in saying how seriously I worry that this well-intended measure designed to tackle the curse of online gambling is in danger, in fact, of not solving that problem, but exacerbating another, which is the deeply fragile finances of a great sport that I think we all, across all parties here today, have expressed our love for. And I'm really fearful that we are in danger of making what in 15 years of government and 30 years of watching I've seen as the all too familiar mistake of do something-ery. Something must be done, this is something, let's do it, using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, the law of unintended consequences, punishing the innocent and doing very little to tackle the real problem that we're after, and seriously damaging the financial resilience of this great industry. And I think that would be a huge mistake, a great shame on us as a generation and on the government that allowed it to happen. And I'm in that spirit. I'm here to try and give the Minister some helpful tips on how we might find the right way through this. I wanted to thank the petitioners who brought us here today, and the Racing Post and British Racing, who've done such good work to raise the issues. And I wanted to look at the British Racing brief and just highlight three really important bits of data they've shared with us. The first, on the impact of these measures. As a result of the Right to Bet survey, 15,000 horse race bettors surveyed in the autumn. More than half said they'll stop betting or bet less if new checks are introduced. 1 in 10 bettors already using a black market bookmaker. 40% are prepared to use the black market if clunky enforcement affordability checks are implemented. 90% oppose postcodes or job titles being used to determine their ability to bet, and 26% have already experienced an affordability check ahead of any legislation being passed. Secondly, the briefing makes clear the full impact of these reforms as introduced, if they're introduced as they stand. Potentially £50 million cost to this industry that is already, as my honourable friend, the member for Lowestoft, has just made clear, is already struggling. That is not something that we should lightly accept. And then thirdly, the point that they make that the 500 a year upper threshold for frictionless checks works out at a net spend of just £1.37 a day. Are we seriously intending on damaging the viability of this great sport, this great industry, in order to look busy in monitoring a £1.37 risk? This is a disproportionate measure, and I fear it's going to have major unintended consequences. I won't, Sir George, rehearse the arguments that have been made very eloquently by many colleagues. I did just want to highlight that there are many who can't speak here today, many peers in the upper house who've taken a very strong interest, I won't name them, and the members for Stratford, for Whittam, for Hexham, who is a minister and therefore can't speak here today, but himself a distinguished amateur jockey who would have spoken today if he could. There are many people across this House who haven't been able to speak today who would have done very forcefully. I want to make one or two points that haven't perhaps been made as fully as they might. The first is, and this has been made, that racing is a vital mainstay of the decentralised rural economy all around this country. And it's absolutely key to the levelling up mission that the government has set out. Yes, it is the sport of kings, as others have said. It's also the sport of stable lads and ladesses, the sport of small businesses all around the country. It's the sport that provides the pyramid at the bottom of which are the point-to-points and the pony clubs and all of that grassroots equestrian activity that we love and rely on. And from Yarmouth to Chepstow, Wincanton to Kelso, Cartmel to Catterick, many tracks are really integral to their local economy. It touches on and is instrumental in 60 marginal seats, not a small number in an election year, 80,000 direct jobs, 100,000 indirect jobs, and 8,000 SMEs. This isn't a fringe activity. This is a very key activity at the heart of our decentralised economy. And I would just make this point that this isn't, an earlier speaker suggested, well, we don't need betting to support the boat race or to support one-off events. Horses are not machines, and you can't have an industry based on one race a year. The reason we can have the Derby is that we have all of those other races that build up to it. The same with the Grand National. These are the pinnacles of great pyramids of activity that start at small, windy tracks all around the country. And horses can't just be parked for 364 days a year and then asked to run. And the training of horses, the conditioning of horses, is something that requires activity all through the year. I'll happily give way.
I just felt through all of this debate, we haven't really mentioned those beautiful creatures and the joy it is to watch them race.
They love to run.
And all those who work with them and train them and look after them, and how important that is really to all of us who have spoken today.
And I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. She makes a good point. They're beautiful, and what a joy it is to watch them exercising, whether in Moulton, in Yorkshire, or in wherever it is around the country. The sight of horses exercising in preparation for racing is part of that rural economy. Secondly, I want to make the point that it is a jewel in the crown as an activity and industry of our global soft power. And the truth is that coming from Newmarket as a child, I've watched as that town and that industry has become very reliant, over-reliant, I would suggest, on a few very wealthy families who've done an amazing service to our sport. But we have to make sure that we're not reliant on a very small number of individuals to maintain the viability of an industry. And that puts this debate in a wider context. Crucially, I want to really highlight that there is a very serious problem in our society of addiction to gambling, and particularly online gambling. And there is a growing body of evidence, and I say this as the former Minister for Life Science, somebody who's had a career in medical research, that the causes of these addictive behaviours, of these cycles of addiction, are not simply based on repeat activity. They are a symptom of much deeper underlying causes, often genetic, often and nearly always neurological. There's a whole series of conditions that drive that underlying cycle of addictive behaviour. It's not that you have a bet on a horse and then you have a second, and it's entirely addictive. Indeed, in my experience, betting on horses is quite the opposite. I've very seldom made much money, and I very seldom carry on doing it with that in mind. No, what drives the addictive behaviour is not. Its underpinning neuroscience and wider conditions. And we really need, as a society, to take those very seriously.
Will you give way on that point? Isn't there a more specific distinction there that he almost drew out, which is that the placing of a bet and then waiting many minutes as a minimum and for a result is neurologically distinct to a bet which gives an immediate immediate hit, which has where the repeat bet would be based on the physiological immediacy of the previous result, whereas horse racing breaks that and has a different neurological and therefore impact on addiction. And therefore, wouldn't it be right in law and in policy to completely separate these proposals when it comes to online games of chance from the wonderful sport of horse racing? It would be easy to do in law. Let's just split the two.
Well, my honourable friend anticipates the logic of the argument I was building towards. Exactly right. Exactly right. And that's why I go on to make my next point, which is that if we're seriously thinking of tackling this curse of addictive online gambling, then surely we should be looking at a whole range of other behaviours as well and other products. And this seems a disproportionate way of tackling a real problem, if indeed that's what it is. And others have mentioned the logical consistency of extending these checks on alcohol, on tobacco, on car hire purchase, on, dare I say it, mortgages, on all sorts of things that we might say, well, people can't afford. And I do worry that this could be the thin end of a very big wedge in which the state decides that it's its job not to regulate properly, but to start asking whether people can actually afford to do it. And that is an Orwellian dystopia I really don't want to live in. The truth is we have got to think about racing's sustainable resilience properly. And I absolutely echo the comments of my honourable friend who spoke before me. The truth is prize money is falling fast, costs have risen fast and are stubbornly high, and competition is eating our lunch. And if you look at Irish and French racing, we are hemorrhaging a very serious industry. So this is not a situation in which we make a small measure, a small reform against a very healthy industry. This is an industry that is really struggling and needs our help, and I'm worried that the law of unintended consequences will make this worse. I wanted, just as I close, to make a point about technology. It's been asserted often that we don't have the technology to really be able to do these checks properly. I think that's right at the moment, but wouldn't it be an amazing thing if we decided to lead? We're already an AI powerhouse. If we decided to really use technology properly, to start to analyse properly that addictive behaviour and start to look at the betting traits on digital betting that indicate. Now, there are plenty of markers. Indeed, studies have looked at this. There are over 70 markers of harmful gambling have been identified, 16 that really drive this activity. And I just suggest that there might be an opportunity for us to use some technology better to really tackle those behaviours online that drive the problem that we're trying to solve. I echo the comments of my friend, the member for Suffolk West, that actually on-track racing, I would go so far as to say, is one of the best ways to introduce people to responsible gambling. And I remember taking my 2 children, giving them £5 each to the 2,000 guineas, and they decided to put it together on an each-way bet, a smart move. They're clever children. And even more clever, my son decided to take my daughter's advice because she knows about horses, and he looked at the odds because he knows about numbers, and they put £5 each way on Galileo Gold, who stormed to victory. And they learnt a lot that day about gambling. They saw people who drunk too much, who were losing too much. They didn't. I took the money and gave it to them. And they discovered a lot. And I think on-track gambling is a fabulous way of actually getting people to realise that most of the decisions in life we take are a gamble one way or another. And it's how you take them that really matters. So let me conclude, Sir George, by saying I'm not here in any way for the health of the gambling industry. I'm here interested in the health of UK racing and in the real identification of the at-risk addiction that we see cursing so much of our society. I mean, in particular, those games of chance that have driven such addiction. The Minister has a difficult job on his hands. I've sat at that box with packed Westminster houses calling for reform, and I would simply say this to him. I know he has a very difficult job. The Prime Minister in North Yorkshire understands the importance of this industry. The Secretary of State next to Newmarket, she in fact has the breeder of Galileo Gold in her constituency, I know understands it. And I would urge him that it's not too late to change tack and come back with a serious package of measures designed at these 2 twin problems: the sustainability of racing's finances and the genuine opportunity for this country to lead in harnessing technology and smart regulation for the tackling of gambling addiction. If not, then I would urge him to look seriously at the net loss provisions. They're too simple, they're too low, to look at the technology data opportunity, to focus on that real challenge, and to take very seriously the financial sustainability of racing. When an industry warns that this will cost them 50 million, we have a duty, I think, to listen.
Yeah. Very nicely spoken. Thank you very much, Sir George, and thank the Honourable Member for Neath for leading off in this debate. I just want to say very briefly to the Honourable Member for Dumfriesshire, Clydesdale and Tweeddale, if horse racing was even partially responsible for fomenting an uprising against the UK government, I would be leading the charge. But it's not. It's a terrific sport which people gamble on and enjoy. And this petition is a tiny little bit about horse racing and a lot about the black market and affordability checks. But we spent nearly 2.5 hours more talking about the horse racing industry. And I'm delighted. Before you put me down, I'm delighted. It's great to see that so many MPs here today have recognised the fact that online gambling is a dangerous thing, and online casinos are a dangerous thing, and we have to be on top of that to help people away from the course of addiction. Because I haven't seen many of those members sit in front of grieving parents when their child has been driven to complete suicide. I have seen them in the racecourses, and I have seen them back up their racecourses, which is understandable. If I had a racecourse in my constituency, I would be saying it's a hugely important part of my constituency, and it generates money, and the supply chain around it is very important. Not right now. It's hugely important. And we look at the sort of money the gambling industry feeds into the industry.
Asserted that members who spoke in favour of racing or who have racecourses in their constituencies have never sat in front of grieving parents and don't know anything about addiction and have never comforted those affected by addiction. The honourable gentleman knows nothing about me, and he knows nothing about many other colleagues who spoke. And I'd ask him to be very careful about how he approaches what he says, and that he has sensitivity before making assertions about any member here, or their motivations, or their families, or their experience of addiction.
Not a point of order, but the honourable gentleman managed to get that off his chest.
No,
Ronnie
I
Cowan.
absolutely take on board what you said, and I apologise if I've worded that wrongly. I was talking about the sessions we'd had with the APPG for gambling department. I appreciate, as was pointed out earlier on, that many people have been touched by the curse of gambling addiction. I apologise if I got that overhanded. The point here is that I think it's understandable that so many people have raced to sign this petition. They've been motivated to sign this petition, 649894, which calls the UK government to not implement proposed financial risk checks for online gambling. The gambling industry, led and paid for this lobby, have been hell-bent on spreading disinformation which is designed to create uncertainty and raise concerns amongst people that enjoy the occasional gamble. I understand the punters' point of view when they feel the fear behind this, because that's the message they've been fed. The truth about affordability checks is, however, more complicated. I am not a prohibitionist. How many times have I had to say that? I'm not trying to ban gambling. I do want to create a safe environment for gambling. It may come as a surprise that affordability checks were not the invention of the APPG on gambling-related harm. This is not some mendacious ploy that the group is using. It's an idea that was mooted in 2019 by Tom Watson, when I believe he was still the MP for West Bromwich East. And industry leader Richard Flint, when he was at Sky Bet, supported Mr Watson by saying there are too many people losing money that they can't afford online. We need to work together as an industry and with the government to limit that. I think that limits on spend rather than stakes is the right way to go, and those limits should be based on affordability. He also acknowledged that these limits could lead to a drop in operator revenue, and clarified that by adding, there will be some online firms in the short term that would make less money as a consequence, and added, and getting straight to the point, but then that spend shouldn't happen anyway. A point that maybe the Jockey Club should consider as our CEO launched this petition, citing a potential loss in the horse racing betting levy, which according to their own board's annual report
was worth £100 million or £5 million lost. But what price? What price in a life? What price in the number of people who have been driven to complete suicide? Turning back to the need for affordability checks. A year later, at the 2020 Lords Committee, the UK's biggest operator, the CEOs of the Big Five, spoke enthusiastically about the need for affordability checks as a key mechanism to reduce harm. Industry CEOs saying that the way to go is affordability, and to ensure that when people come to our sites, they can only afford to lose or bet an amount that, quite frankly, they can afford and are comfortable with. So what's new? What's new is that since the White Paper, the Government and the Gambling Commission have proposed actual threshold figures for these checks. Affordability is no longer an abstract concept. It is tied to precise thresholds. The industry don't like the fact that the White Paper has called their bluff, and so they're kicking up a storm. It's clear that to create a safe environment, those that may be categorised as the pro-gambling lobby and those such as myself that could be called a safer gambling lobby agree that affordability is an area that needs tightening up. I wonder if that was explained to everyone that signed the petition. And when the petition says the proposed checks could see bettors having to prove that they can afford their hobby if they sustain losses as low as £137 per day, and that figure has been scoffed at a few times in this debate, £500 a year, nothing to us. Nothing to us as MPs on 86 grand a year, but £500 a year can be the difference between some people putting money in the meter or putting food on the table. And what we're trying to do is stop them getting to the point where they lose that money in the first place. So please, don't belittle that. If the checks say they can afford it, then they can afford it. We're trying to help those at risk. Surely even all gamblers can see that because they understand risk. The UK government has already said the proposed checks are only on the very highest spending online customers. The Gambling Commission estimates that approximately 20% of customers' accounts would meet the threshold for a financial vulnerability check. The second line of this petition is about the black market. The Gambling Commission has already reported to us that the size of the online black market has been overstated by the industry and must be kept in proportion. The argument follows that if we want to prevent growth of the black market, regulation to prevent incidences of harm that lead to addiction is the solution to eliminating demand for a black market and not its cause. Harm prevention will mean fewer addicts, fewer self-exclusions and fewer attempts to circumvent the regulated market in the first place. And the next line, to me, is the key to this. We are concerned there will also be a negative impact on British horse racing finances due to a reduction in better turnover and resulting fall in levy yield. A Trojan horse, if ever I've seen one. And the point behind this... Sure.
I've been listening with increased disappointment to the tone which the member's taken, and given the importance of tackling problem gambling, doesn't he also recognise, like the 7,000 people who live in my constituency, the importance of horse racing? And does he recognise that horse racing betting has equally low problem gambling associated with it as betting on the National Lottery? And the National Lottery is carved out of this, and therefore shouldn't horse racing betting be carved out of it, and then we can all concentrate on tackling gambling harms exactly as he would like to?
Well, I'll bring your attention to the message that's been given out clearly by the UK Government. The Government are keen to ensure that measures such as these checks do not adversely affect racing or interrupt the customer journey. They also cannot push away high net worth individuals such as owners and trainers who invest in the sport. So I would suggest, it's not for me to say, the Government's all over this. The Government understands the difference between online gambling, casino gambling and horse racing. So the key to this, from my point of view, is that people are spending more than they can afford, and as a result, some are dying. That's a human cost, and that cost is completely unacceptable.
Sir George, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I'd like to begin by referring to my register of interests. For over 100,000 people signed the petition on financial risk checks in less than a month shows the strength of feeling on this topic, and I'd like to pay tribute to the member for Neath for leading this important debate. This issue is important for everyone who offered their signature, as well as the gambling and racing industries, who want to be sure that these checks are truly frictionless before they are rolled out. But it is also crucial for the organisations and families who are concerned about gambling harms and want confirmation that the updated regulation in the gambling white paper will be going ahead. The government must be able to strike this balance as they have promised. So I'd like to begin my remarks by setting the context for introducing financial risk checks as part of the gambling white paper more broadly. Around half of adults across the UK gamble each month, with the vast majority doing so safely, moderately and in a way they enjoy. Indeed, growing up, I remember my nan going to bingo every week, and I've always enjoyed going to the races, having pleased to attend the Ledger last year. However, for some, gambling can become a more serious problem. Around 300,000 people across the country experience problem gambling, and 1.8 million are considered at elevated risk. The last time gambling laws were updated was back in 2005. And since then, the landscape has changed dramatically. Thanks to our tablets, laptops and phones, most people now have the potential to carry a casino in their pocket, meaning they can gamble anywhere and make huge losses in a very short time. As the member for Swansea East outlined, and I really appreciate the work she has done over many years in this area. It is because of this rapid growth in technology and the growing awareness we have of the impact of gambling harms that changes to our gambling regulation are now long overdue. In my time as Shadow Gambling Minister, I've met with some of those who are recovering from addiction, as well as family members who have suffered the unimaginable pain of losing a loved one. For these people, it's absolutely clear that gambling harm has the potential to be devastating and that more must be done to ensure families are protected from this, as the member for Sheffield Central powerfully spoke of. Affordability checks form part of this new modernised system of gambling regulation that is fit for the future, accompanied by other measures such as online stake limits, data sharing between gambling firms and a crackdown on the black market activity through the regulator will ensure the law does more to protect children and adults vulnerable to harm. The member for Chingford spoke about how he thinks early intervention in the form of these checks can make a difference to change that course of addiction. And it may well be the case, and it's obviously important if we can make early intervention. But it strikes me that there is a missing piece here, because it's not clear what intervention will take place as a result of these checks. This is perhaps not an issue we can solve here today, but I think it does need to be considered in the context of the wider white paper. However, as has been outlined by colleagues today, it is also important that our regulation recognises that many people enjoy betting safely and without harm, as the member for Shipley robustly, as always, outlined. The government must therefore be clear on how they will actually go about ensuring affordability checks are accurate, frictionless and non-intrusive for consumers as they have promised. I have a number of more specific questions for the Minister about this, which I will conclude my speech with, but I'd like to speak briefly first of all about why in this context the racing industry in particular are concerned about the nature of the checks. And of course, many members here today have spoken about the impact that racecourses have in their constituencies. I'm going to try and list them from Bath to the member for West Suffolk, of course, with Newmarket, from Windsor, the member for Tewkesbury and Cheltenham. I believe the member for St Helens North, who is a huge champion for the industry, spoke about his racecourse Haydock. In Musselburgh, in East Lothian, and indeed the member for Waveney spoke about the economic benefit they have to these areas, and apologies if I have missed any out. Indeed, last week I hosted a roundtable with representatives from the racing sector, including those who started today's petition, who shared their thoughts with me on the potential unintended consequences of the checks, as the member for Norfolk spoke about very powerfully in his contribution. Racing and gambling have a naturally symbiotic relationship, with the success of each industry somewhat dependent on the other. And with over 5 million spectators enjoying a trip to the races each year, it is clear that many people seem to enjoy the combination too, making it the country's second favourite sport. And as a result of this partnership, however, the government predicts that the white paper will cost the racing industry £14.9 million, with the British Horse Racing Association saying it could rise to almost £50 million a year when considering the impact to the levy, media rights deals and overall funding. Losses of this kind could in turn, as we have heard today, lead to lower prize money, decreasing participation, job losses in the rural economy and an overall decline in the sport. It is important for racing that the Government and Gambling Commission work with the industry to ensure financial risk checks are truly frictionless, targeted and accurate. I will give way.
Very generous, and can I commend her? She's very knowledgeable about this subject, and I've got a lot of time for the honourable lady, as she knows. Based on what she said, would she support the calls that we've heard from many honourable members today, that there should perhaps be a distinction made between games of skill and games of chance, which I took from what she was saying would probably deal with the two separate issues that she was referring to?
I understand that argument, and I do have some sympathy for it, but I don't think we can kind of carve out horse racing, and the racing in particular, as being sort of free of harm. I simply just don't think that's the case. Of course, the harm for the horses is less than some, but it's greater than others. And so I think we do need to strike a balance, and I am sympathetic to the argument that he makes, and I'm sure the Minister will pick it up when he rises to his feet. It is also why it's right we work to find a future-proof settlement on the horse racing betting levy, which contributes around £80 to £100 million to the sport. And I hope the Minister, therefore, can give us an update today on how the review into this is progressing on all sides. Moving on then to the specifics of how the checks will be conducted, the Minister must be clear on how friction will be removed from the current system of checks. Indeed, in those rarer cases where it is proposed that bank statements or payslips might be needed as part of an enhanced check, it is unclear just how frictionless this process could possibly be. Concerns have also been raised with me over the value of using net losses alone without combining it with other markers of harm to prompt an affordability check. And as a result, it would be helpful today for the Minister to set out in full the latest thinking on how the checks will be conducted so that they are accurately targeted and have limited user input. Or in the absence of this, could he let us know when we might expect a full response to the consultation? The Gambling Commission did confirm late last week that the lower level checks would use publicly available data only and will run on higher thresholds to start with. They also said for enhanced checks there will be a pilot to test the details of data sharing. So would the Minister be able to confirm this pilot to the House today and outline how the Department will work with the Commission, credit agencies and the gambling industry to ensure their smooth running? And further to this, it would be reassuring if the Minister could set out how the pilot and the period of higher thresholds will be evaluated. For example, what issues will be the Commission looking out for and what criteria will be success or will define success? It is important that we get this right. If the checks are not frictionless or indeed are more disruptive than they are genuinely useful to those at risk, then there is a risk that customers will be driven from the regulated industry to the black market, where there are no safer gambling protections whatsoever. And I think this is a real concern, as has been spoken about today. So to conclude, I think there is a consensus over the need to update our regulation so that vulnerable people are better protected from gambling harms in the modern age. But at the same time, it's the punters, racing and the gambling industry that deserve some clarity on how the government will ensure affordability checks are carried out with accuracy and in a way that does not cause unnecessary friction for those gambling responsibly. And I look forward to hearing from the Minister on how the Department plans to strike this balance.
Minister Stuart Andrew.
Thank you, Sir George. And I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Neath for tabling this important debate today, as well as everyone else that has signed the petition. My honourable friend, the member for Tewkesbury, said that I always turn up to these events. So I must confess I didn't know I had a choice. I may have made a different decision if I did know that, but there you go. And my right honourable friend, the member for Dumfriesshire, Clydesdale and Tweedale, quite rightly mentioned the book that he showed me. It looked like a very extensive book. I haven't had a chance to read it all yet, but I'm sure that The Strongholds of Satan, written by William Morgan, will be valuable as I further my education in this whole exciting field of policy. But also, can I say to the Honourable Lady, when she opened her comments, that she outlined the varying points that actually come up in this debate, the various views from varying stakeholders from whichever side of the debate they may be on. And I am grateful for all of those comments that we've had. It has been interesting and thought-provoking, and it is good to hear those different perspectives, and that is why I am always trying to take the time to meet and engage and, crucially, listen to the points that are put forward to me. Because, as some have mentioned, this is about walking a fine line, about getting what is right to tackle those who, or help those who may be entering the risk of gambling harm, but at the same time making sure those who want to continue to gamble safely to do so. And I want to recognise the concerns that many have had with the proposed system of checks for the highest spending online customers to help identify that harm, concerns that have been raised with colleagues, it's been raised in the media, and it's certainly been raised with me over the past few months. But I do believe that the proposals for financial risk checks will present and represent a significant improvement for both businesses and customers compared to the current situation. Indeed, a recent Gamble Aware study showed that almost 3 in 5 adults support the introduction of the checks. Nonetheless, we and the Gambling Commission have listened, and we want to get this right. We are clear that those risk checks should not over-regulate the gambling sector. They should not unduly disrupt the millions of people who gamble without suffering harm, and should not cause unnecessary damage to sectors which rely on betting, and in particular horse racing. And we in the Gambling Commission both recognise that it's not our job to tell people how to spend their money. As outlined in the Gambling White Paper, we want to balance this freedom with the necessary action to tackle the devastating consequence which harmful gambling can have for individuals and for communities. And we know that operators are currently operating onerous, ad hoc and inconsistent so-called affordability checks on a number of customers, often without being clear on why the checks are happening, and normally requiring customers to provide data manually. And the proposed system will be a significant improvement in having clear and proportionate rules which all operators are held to, and allowing for financial data to be shared seamlessly with operators instead of burdening customers with information requests. Now, the Gambling Commission's consultation on these checks closed in October. I know from my discussions with them that they have given careful consideration to the nearly 2,000 responses that they've received, and they have been working very closely with relevant stakeholders, including my department, industry representatives, the Information Commissioner's Office, the financial services sector, and others to refine their proposals. And understanding consumer perspective is vital for the Commission. This is why they have a programme of research on the consumer voice. This is an ongoing piece of research which uses qualitative and quantitative methods to gather consumer perspectives, including on the consultation proposals relating to these to financial risk. This research has helped inform their thinking and will be published by the Commission alongside the consultation response. And I'm glad that the points that have been raised here today are that some of the issues our punters are facing are not just down to these checks. There are other issues that quite rightly have been raised. Now, following the publication of a blog by the Commission on the 22nd of February, I'm pleased to be able to provide colleagues here today with an update on these checks. Firstly, the Gambling Commission has confirmed that they will be proceeding with the proposal for financial risk checks. This includes the frictionless light touch financial vulnerability checks and those enhanced ones. However, following feedback through the consultation, the Commission have confirmed that they will not require gambling businesses to consider an individual's personal details, such as their postcode or job title, as part of the checks. I know that this was a key concern for those who signed the petition, and I hope that this demonstrates that the Commission is carefully listening to the concerns as they finalise how these checks will work. To ease the introduction of these checks, they will initially come into force at a higher threshold, as we've heard, for a short period of time, before reverting to a lower threshold later in the year. We expect this lower threshold to be closely aligned with that proposed in the White Paper. This will allow for a smoother implementation for the small number of affected consumers. And these checks will not be intrusive and will use, as has already been said, publicly available data. The Commission will require industry to introduce these frictionless, light-touch checks in 2 stages, with the intention this will happen over the course of this summer. With the enhanced financial risk assessments will also be implemented for the important protections they can offer consumers who may be at financial risk, and to ensure that assessing financial risk can be done in a more frictionless manner than is currently possible. Now, the Gambling Commission will therefore conduct a pilot and data collection period. The pilot will involve the Commission working with the credit reference agencies and a selection of gambling businesses to ensure that the process of assessment is as effective and streamlined as possible. It will run for a minimum of 4 months, and the Commission will consider all issues that arise during the pilot stage, and are clear that this will help to refine the final requirements and the models for data sharing. This will also help to ensure the intentions and commitments of the White Paper are met. Now, I am sure that everybody would agree that it is important that we do not skip ahead to full implementation before getting the details right. Indeed, I know many honourable and right honourable members here, including my honourable friend, the member for Shipley, have made suggestions to both myself and to the Commission, and I know that he and all of us want to find a solution that actively protect those at most risk of harm. And so the Commission is actively considering all of those proposals, including my honourable friends, and many of the ideas that have been raised are things that I can confirm will be explored via the pilot stage. And that will include looking at whether or not Cato or SCORE data is being used, so that all of the decisions being made will be based on the evidence of what actually is working.
Will you give way on that point?
Quickly.
Will that also include carving out horse racing in the same way that the National Lottery is carved out, because both of them are have the lowest impact on gambling harm, and it would be inappropriate to treat the two differently?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's say I've heard the National Lottery mentioned a few times. Yes, it is unique. It's under its own separate framework, legislative framework. But under the 4th licence conditions, player protection requirements will be increased as part of that, and that will be conditions on payments for support in research and education and treatment. And I have heard about the carve-out for horse racing, and I acknowledge that, of course, higher gambling harm does happen with online casinos, but we do know that those with gambling harm use multiple products, and some of them have been using horse racing products. In fact, I have actually heard harrowing stories of people who have made losses just on horse racing products. So I'm going to crack on. I literally haven't got much time left, and I really do want to get through as much. If I've got time at the end, I'll happily take his intervention. I hope it's therefore clear that both the Government and the Commission want this to be a genuine pilot of how data sharing would work. And throughout this pilot, gambling businesses will not be expected to act on the data they receive. However, they will, of course, be expected to continue to protect consumers by implementing their own existing consumer safety controls and remaining compliant with our existing regulatory requirements. The Government and I are supportive of the evidence-led and consumer-centred approach being proposed during the pilot. The Gambling Commission will publish its full consultation response very soon, but can I remind colleagues that this is about online betting. People who are going to the race courses or going into those betting shops will not be a part of this, so that day-out experience should not be effective. Now then, in the meantime, we have also challenged industry to be more transparent with customers. There are currently requirements in place for gambling operators to identify customers at risk of harm and to take action. But there are no specific safer gambling requirements on how or when gambling operators must consider the financial circumstances of their customers. And where there have been failures to identify and act on clear signs of harm, the Commission has not hesitated to take action, including fines. However, there has been, as I said earlier, inconsistency across the sector, and that is why we are working closely with them, and the Gambling Commission are working with them to see that we can have a much better system in this interim period. In light of this, and with the meetings I've had with colleagues and also with the Betters Forum, I have urged the industry to work together to mitigate the impact that customers are having in providing information and documentation whilst we develop this new frictionless system of checks. And we understand that, as I said, they are working towards delivering an industry-led code that would apply in the interim period, and I know progress is being made, and I hope that we'll be able to report on agreement that may come as soon as possible so that customers can have more clarity of what can be expected. Now, I'd like to turn to concerns that have been raised here today about the black market. I can reassure colleagues that I take these threats posed by illegal online marketing and markets very seriously indeed. We know it can pose a variety of risks to consumers, including allowing access to those who have self-excluded through GamStop. It is unfair to those businesses that abide by the rules. As set out in the White Paper, we committed to giving the Commission more powers to try and block and disrupt illegal gambling websites, and we're delivering on this commitment through the Criminal Justice Bill. This will allow the Gambling Commission to suspend IP addresses and domain names if they are being used for the purposes of serious crime connected with unlicensed gambling. And the Commission has been able to invest in work to combat illegal gambling. It has succeeded in disrupting and reducing illegal traffic into British gambling markets. This work should be enhanced by the new disruption powers that it will receive once the Criminal Justice Bill has passed through Parliament. I'd now like to turn to horse racing specifically, as has been raised here today. Concerns have been raised by the British Horse Racing Authority and other stakeholders within industry about the impact of the checks on the sport. And I want to reassure everybody that we have heard these concerns and we take them extremely seriously. I've already met with many of you here today, including members of the Racing and Bloodstock APPG, and I've also met with the Horse Racing Betters Forum to hear a customer perspective. And I'll continue to engage with this sector and those affected by these reforms, because we are a strong supporter of horse racing. I acknowledge the many points that have been made and the significant contribution that horse racing makes to our economy and the central role it plays in the livelihoods of rural communities. The employment it supports across racecourses, training yards, breeding operations and related sectors reflects a powerful industry that is respected at home and abroad. And many colleagues here today have spoken or written to me on this subject, and I have seen firsthand the care that is given to racehorses on a recent visit to a training yard in Middleham. So I am therefore clear that we must ensure that these checks do not adversely affect racing, all those who work in the sector or interrupt the customer journey. They also must not push away high net worth individuals such as owners and trainers that invest in the sport. Now, the Gambling Commission has worked very closely with operators to explore the practical aspects of implementing these checks. And I know that colleagues have said that they've seen an improved relationship between the Commission and the industry. It's also carefully considering responses to the consultation, which have helped shape the implementation plans. But we want to protect those at risk, and I make no apology for us doing that, but with minimal disruption to the majority who I recognise bet on horse racing with no ill effect. And whilst we recognise the importance of the horse racing, We know it's also that the levy is an important piece of work. I'm going to run out of time now, but I will happily write to colleagues that have been here today to update, because we are having discussions, or the horse racing betting and the Betting and Gaming Council, I know, have had discussions this morning about an offer that is on the table for the levy. And I will be able to update colleagues, I hope, shortly. And with that, given that time has run out, I apologise for not covering all of the points, but there is an extensive debate.
Very briefly, Christina Rees.
Very briefly, I just, on behalf of the Petitions Committee, I'd like to thank all honourable and right honourable members for their very valuable contributions. Thank you.
Order. Order. The sitting stands adjourned.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.